The city did not welcome things that fell from the sky. Mega City 1 had learned that lesson across 2 centuries of asteroid debris, aerial gang wars, chem falls from collapsed weather platforms, and the occasional lunatic in a jetpack raining manifesto leaflets over Sector 13. The sky above the city was not a place of wonder. It was a delivery mechanism for catastrophe, and the 800 million souls packed into the megablocks below had long since stopped looking up with anything resembling hope. So when the dimensional rift opened above the Angeltown interchange at 0347 hours, a tear in the fabric of spatial continuity approximately 3 meters wide, crackling with blue-white electromagnetic discharge that fried 4 traffic drones, a Tri-D billboard advertising Umpty Candy, and the navigational systems of a H-wagon on routine patrol. The city's first response was not curiosity. It was paperwork. The H-wagon crew filed an incident report before they even confirmed what had fallen. Standard protocol. In Mega City 1, documentation preceded understanding. The judges who arrived on the scene 4 minutes later, 2 sector uniforms named Vasquez and Okafor, approached the smoking crater in the interchange's 3rd level with a particular brand of weary aggression that 20 years of street judging produced. They had their lawgivers drawn. They had their helmets sealed against the acrid electromagnetic stink still bleeding off the impact zone. They had absolutely no framework for what they found inside the crater. It stood 6 feet tall and weighed in excess of 300 pounds, although it had landed with a precision that suggested the weight was distributed across a chassis engineered for exactly this kind of punishment. The armor was dark, a deep blue-black that caught the sodium glare of the interchange's emergency lighting and threw it back without warmth. A visor, a targeting array built into the left side of a helmet that was not a helmet in any design Vasquez or Okafor recognized from any Justice Department file, any black market arms catalog, or any known corporate weapons division currently operating within city limits. The chest plate bore a badge, 5-pointed, the word police stamped into the metal with the permanence of something that had survived more than one attempt to remove it. The machine was on one knee. It not damaged. Vasquez would confirm this in her incident report with professional understatement, but apparently orienting. Its head moved in a slow, deliberate arc, scanning the interchange, cataloging, processing. When it finally rose to its full height, the hydraulic movement was so precise and so quiet that Okafor took 2 involuntary steps backward before his training reasserted itself. "On the ground," Vasquez said. "Justice Department, you are in violation of—" "I am a police officer." The voice was human in cadence, and something else entirely in resonance. A baritone that carried the weight of a man who had learned to speak through a speaker system and had never quite lost the memory of what his real voice had felt like. "Detroit Metro Police, badge number—" "Detroit," Okafor repeated. "Michigan. United States of America." The 2 judges looked at each other across the crater's rim. "There is no Michigan," Vasquez said carefully. "There is no United States of America. There hasn't been for 140 years. The machine, the officer, was silent for 4 seconds. Its targeting array cycled. Its chest rose and fell with the ghost of a breathing pattern that served no biological function, but that Alex Murphy had never been able to entirely eliminate. Because Alex Murphy had once been a man who breathed, and some things survived even OCP's most thorough redesigns. "Then I need to speak with someone in authority," RoboCop said. "I need to understand where I am, and I need to report for duty. If you want to see more characters dragged into universes that were never built to hold them, just hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character and the universe you'd want to see them in down in the comments below. All men must die, but legends endure." Judge Vasquez's incident report, filed at 0412 hours and flagged for immediate senior judge review, used the phrase unknown mechanized humanoid entity claiming law enforcement status with the careful neutrality of someone who understood that the wrong word choice could end a career. She noted the entity's apparent stability, its non-aggressive posture upon contact, its functional armament. She cataloged the Auto 9 with the professional thoroughness of someone who recognized a weapon designed to end confrontations quickly, and she appended a single personal observation at the bottom of the official text, which her supervising judge would later delete before forwarding to the Grand Hall of Justice. It seemed confused, she wrote. Not dangerous, confused. Lost, confused. Like it was looking for something it already knew wasn't going to be there. The senior judge who received the flagged report read it twice, set it down on his desk in Sector House 9, and reached for his comm link with the resigned certainty of a man who had served Mega City 1 for 31 years and had learned that the city always found new ways to make his life more complicated. He opened a channel to the one judge whose case clearance rate, whose documented threat neutralization record, and whose particular brand of absolute, immovable, terrifying competence made him the appropriate response to something no existing protocol covered. Dredd, he said. Gummers, we have a situation at Angeltown Interchange. I heard. The voice on the other end of the comm was not the voice of a man who had been sleeping. It was the voice of a man who did not sleep so much as temporarily suspend operations. I'm already en route. The senior judge looked at Vasquez's incident report one more time, at the grainy H-wagon footage attached to it, showing the figure in the crater, on one knee, scanning a city it had never been designed to understand. Dredd, he said. The entity is claiming police officer status. A pause. The sound of a lawmaster's engine beneath it, the city's perpetual night roar behind that. Everyone in this city claims something, Dredd said. I'll determine what it actually is. RoboCop stood at the interchange's edge and looked at Mega City 1 for the first time with full optical clarity, his targeting systems having completed their initial environmental scan and returned data that his processors were still working to contextualize. The megablocks rose around him like the walls of a canyon that had been designed by someone who hated the concept of sky. Each block was a city unto itself, hundreds of thousands of residents stacked in concrete and desperation. The walkways between them choked even at this hour with the ambient human noise of a population too large for the space it occupied. Advertisements cycled across every available surface. A Tri-D screen 40 stories up was cycling through what appeared to be a crime report, the anchor delivering the night's body count with the professional calm of a man reading weather. The numbers were high. The anchor's expression suggested they were not unusually high. His uplink attempted to reach the OCP satellite network. It found nothing. His GPS attempted to triangulate his position against known Detroit infrastructure. It found nothing. His emergency broadcast attempted to reach Metro Division Dispatch. It found nothing but static in the city's own electromagnetic noise, which was considerable. Alex Murphy stood in the wreckage of whatever had brought him here and ran the calculations that his programming insisted on running even when the results were operationally useless. Distance to known support, incalculable. Return route, unknown. Mission parameters, unassigned. He had 3 prime directives and a 4th that OCP had buried so deep in his programming that he'd had to nearly die a second time to find it. But directives required context. They required a chain of command, a jurisdiction, a city that needed protecting. He looked at Mega City 1, 800 million people, crime statistics that his processors initially rejected as corrupted data before a secondary analysis confirmed them as accurate. A Justice Department structure that bore enough surface resemblance to law enforcement that his systems flagged it as allied infrastructure, but with operational parameters that his ethical subroutines were already beginning to generate questions about. He had no chain of command. He had no jurisdiction. He had no city. But there was a city in front of him. The sound of a lawmaster reached him before the headlight did. A single beam cutting through the interchange's sodium-stained dark. The engine note of something built for authority rather than speed, though it was clearly capable of both. And the bike stopped 12 feet from where he stood, and the judge who dismounted did so with the economy of movement of a man who had performed this action thousands of times and saw no reason to vary it. He was approximately the same height as RoboCop. The helmet was full-faced, the eagle wing badge above the visor catching the light. The jaw beneath the visor's lower edge was the jaw of a man who had decided somewhere in his early career that expressions were an unnecessary energy expenditure. The uniform was the uniform of someone who had never once in their professional life wondered whether they were the law. They regarded each other across 12 feet of Megacity 1 pavement. Two machines, one of flesh disciplined to the point of mechanism, is one of mechanism carrying the ghost of flesh, and the interchange hummed around them with the city's indifferent electrical heartbeat. "Judge Dredd," the judge said. It was not an introduction, it was a declaration. "Officer Alex Murphy," RoboCop said. "Detroit Metro Police. Detroit doesn't exist. I'm aware. I've been informed. Then you're operating without jurisdiction, without authorization, and without legal standing in Megacity 1. Dredd's hand rested near his lawgiver without moving toward it. The posture of a man who was not threatened, but was preparing a range of responses. That makes you a civilian. Civilians in possession of illegal weapons-grade armament face a mandatory 8-year ISO-cube sentence. I'm a police officer. You're a machine claiming to be a police officer in a city where that claim has no legal weight." A pause. "What are you exactly?" RoboCop considered the question with the patience of someone for whom patience was not a virtue, but a processing state. "I am what happens," he said, "when a city decides its officers are worth more as hardware than as men." He looked at the megablocks again, at the crime ticker still cycling on the Tri-D screen above them. "I suspect that's a concept this city understands." Dredd was silent for 3 seconds. In 31 years of service, his fellow judges had learned that Dredd's silences were not absences of thought. They were conclusions being reached. "You'll come with me," Dredd said finally. "Sector House 9. You'll be assessed. Your weapons will be evaluated. Your status will be determined by the Chief Judge's office." He mounted the lawmaster. "You will not discharge your weapon. You will not attempt to exercise any law enforcement function. You will not uphold the law," RoboCop said. Another silence. "Walk," Dredd said. "I'll pace you." RoboCop walked. The lawmaster rolled beside him, and Megacity 1 churned around both of them, indifferent and enormous. 800 million lives stacked in the dark, and somewhere in its labyrinthine, criminal ecosystem, something had already noticed that 2 badges were moving through Sector 9 instead of 1. In the criminal calculus of Megacity 1, that was either a problem or an opportunity. It was never nothing. Because Sector House 9 had seen most things. It had processed block wars that left 300 dead before the judges arrived in force. It had intake logged a man who had somehow constructed a functional nuclear device from umpty candy wrappers and recycled H-Wagon parts. It had hosted, on one memorable occasion, a hostage situation in which the hostage had turned out to be more dangerous than the hostage taker, a fact that had required considerable revision of the incident report's moral framework. The judges who staffed it were not people who startled easily, who expressed wonder readily, or who permitted the city's bottomless capacity for the unexpected to penetrate the professional equilibrium that the Academy of Law spent 5 years constructing and the street spent the next 20 stress testing. They stared at RoboCop anyway. Not obviously. Megacity 1 judges were trained to observe without telegraphing observation, to assess without advertising assessment. But the stares followed him down the corridor from the vehicle bay to the assessment room with the particular quality of attention that professionals give to something that exists outside every category they've been trained to apply. Desk judges found reasons to look up from their screens. A group of 4 cadets on a sector house orientation froze in a cluster near the evidence lockup and were moved along by their supervising judge with a bark that didn't entirely disguise his own momentary lapse of composure. RoboCop cataloged every face. It was not a threatening behavior. It was simply what he did. 32 judges currently in the building, 14 at active stations, 6 in rest rotation. The remainder processing, filing, or performing the administrative machinery of law enforcement that existed in every century and every universe, because crime generated paperwork the way combustion generated heat. The assessment room was functional and deliberately uncomfortable. A design philosophy, RoboCop noted, that Megacity 1 and OCP shared across the 140-year gap that apparently separated their civilizations. A table, 2 chairs, a recording array in the ceiling's corner. A one-way observation panel that was not quite as one-way as its designers had intended, because RoboCop's optical systems read the density differential in the composite material and identified 3 distinct heat signatures behind it without needing to make the observation obvious. Dredd sat across the table. He had not removed his helmet. RoboCop understood this. He had not removed his own. A senior judge named Holloway sat to Dredd's left, a woman in her late 50s whose case file, had RoboCop had access to it, would have shown 33 years of service, a commendation for the Sector 4 block war suppression, and a disciplinary notation from 12 years ago that had been subsequently expunged. She had the face of someone who had spent 3 decades deciding things quickly and living with the consequences. She was the one who spoke first. "Your designation," she said. "Officer Alex Murphy, Detroit Metro Police. Badge number." "We'll use RoboCop," Holloway said. "It's what the H-Wagon crew logged you as. Descriptive enough." She opened a data slate. "You're a cybernetic law enforcement unit. Human origin. Approximately what percentage of your original biological mass remains?" RoboCop considered how to answer a question that he had spent considerable portions of his operational existence not answering, because the answer required him to sit with things that his programming occasionally tried to file under categories that would make them easier to process. "Enough," he said, "that I remember being a father." Holloway's stylus paused above the data slate. Dredd's jaw tightened fractionally, the only part of his face visible, and therefore the only instrument available for expressing whatever that statement had produced in him. "Your weaponry," Holloway continued, recovering with the smoothness of long practice. "The sidearm. Auto 9. Selective fire. I am its sole authorized operator." A pause. "It will not function for anyone else. Which this is not a boast, it is a safety feature. Your chassis armament beyond the sidearm? I would prefer not to provide a full inventory until I understand the legal status of this conversation." RoboCop's optical array moved to the one-way panel. "And until the 3 judges currently observing from behind that partition are either acknowledged or withdrawn, transparency functions better as a reciprocal arrangement." The silence that followed had a specific texture. It was the silence of people recalibrating. Dredd leaned forward slightly. "You detected them." "I detect most things. It's what I was built for." RoboCop returned his attention to Dredd. "What were you built for, Judge?" It was not an aggressive question. It was a genuine one. And asked with the particular directness of someone who understood that the answer to that question defined everything. About a person, about a system, about whether the two things were separable at all. RoboCop had spent a great deal of his operational existence understanding that he was a person and a system simultaneously, and that OCP had designed him with the sincere corporate intention that the system would eventually subsume the person entirely. He was curious whether Megacity 1 had managed something similar. Dredd was quiet for a moment. When he answered, it was with the flatness of someone reciting something that had become so fundamental it had long since ceased to feel like recitation. "To be the law," Dredd said. "To serve it," RoboCop replied. "Or to be it. Those are different things, Judge. I've found that the difference matters more than most departments want to admit." Holloway set down her stylus. She looked at Dredd. Dredd looked at RoboCop with the sustained, evaluating regard of a man running his own internal assessment protocols and finding the results. Not troubling exactly. More precisely, interesting. And interesting, in Dredd's experience, was always more complicated than troubling. "Your arrival," Holloway said, "the rift above Angeltown Interchange. Our tech division has been at the site since 0400. Their preliminary assessment suggests a dimensional breach of a type consistent with experimental temporal spatial manipulation. Someone opened a door and you fell through it." She paused. "Do you have any knowledge of who or what caused it?" "No. I was in Detroit. I'm responding to a disturbance at an OCP research facility. There was energy discharge. Then I was here." A beat. "I had been responding to reports of an illegal weapons experiment. The facility was attempting to develop a dimensional transit capability for military application. It appears they succeeded in ways they did not intend." "OCP," Dredd said. "Omni Consumer Products. My manufacturer and employer. Both simultaneously." The faint, unintended weight in that sentence was not lost on either judge across the table. They had been contracted by the city government to explore dimensional military applications. The research was classified. I was investigating a leak suggesting the experiment was being conducted without proper safety protocols. Without proper safety protocols, Dredd repeated, one with the tone of a man identifying a category of problem so familiar it had become almost restful in its predictability. Corporations, RoboCop said, tend to treat safety protocols as flexible recommendations when the profit margin is sufficiently motivating. Holloway made a sound that was not quite a laugh and was not quite not one. She covered it with a cough that neither of the two figures across the table acknowledged, because both of them were, in their respective ways, professionals. The breach is closed, she said. Tech Division confirms it collapsed within 8 minutes of your transit. There is currently no known mechanism to reopen it. She looked at him steadily. You may be here permanently. RoboCop processed this. His systems ran the calculations 17 times in approximately 2 seconds. Because the calculation was simple, and the result was the same each time, and repetition was the only response his programming could generate to information that his human residue found genuinely difficult to absorb. Detroit was gone. OCP was gone. Whatever remained of the life that had been Alex Murphy, the apartment, the precinct, the particular slant of late afternoon light through a Detroit winter window that he had never been entirely able to stop noticing, even after everything else had been stripped away, was on the other side of a door that no longer existed. I see, he said. His voice gave nothing away. It never did. That was one of OCP's few genuine achievements. The Chief Judge's office will determine your operational status, Holloway continued. Until that determination is made, you are classified as a person of indeterminate legal standing. You are not a judge. You are not a citizen. You are not a criminal, RoboCop suggested. Not yet, Dredd said. It was not a threat. It was a statement of Dredd's relationship with the future, precise, conditional, entirely without malice, and somehow more unsettling than a threat would have been. I want to work, RoboCop said. That is not a request for employment. It is a statement of operational necessity. I was built to serve. I was built to protect. I was built to uphold the law. He looked at Dredd directly. This city has law. This city has people who need protecting. Whatever my legal classification, those two facts don't change. This city has judges, Dredd said. And it doesn't need additional law enforcement from a machine whose protocols and priorities I cannot verify. With respect, I don't require your respect. I require your compliance. The room was quiet. The recording array hummed in the ceiling. Behind the partition, the three observing judges had gone very still. RoboCop held Dredd's gaze, or held the visor that stood in for it, because both of them understood that the visor was not a barrier to the gaze, but an extension of it. I have never, RoboCop said slowly, in my operational existence, failed to uphold the law. I have been shot, dismantled, reprogrammed, and used as a corporate instrument against the people I was designed to protect. I have had my memories stripped and my directives rewritten and my humanity systematically reduced to a filing category. A pause. And every time I found my way back to the law, not to the institution, not to the department, not to the corporation, to the law itself. His optical array adjusted incrementally. Can you say the same, Judge Dredd? That the institution and the law have always been the same thing in your experience? The silence this time was longer. It was Dredd who broke it, and what he said was not what anyone behind the partition expected him to say, and it was not what Holloway expected either, though she would later reflect that perhaps it should have been. No, Dredd said. They haven't always been the same thing. He stood. The chair scraped back with the finality of a decision being made. You'll be assigned temporary quarters in the sector house. You won't patrol. You won't discharge your weapon. You won't exercise any judicial function. He moved toward the door. But you'll observe, and I'll decide what you are after I've seen how you observe. He left. The door sealed behind him with the pneumatic certainty of Megacity One's architecture. Everything in this city built to contain, to process, to hold. RoboCop sat in the assessment room for a moment longer. The recording array hummed. Holloway gathered her data slate without looking at him, which was the most telling thing she'd done since he'd walked through the door, because it meant she was thinking about what had just happened rather than about what came next. He looked at the table's surface, at the faint scratches in the composite material where other people had sat, in other assessments, with other uncertain futures being processed by the city's enormous, heady grinding machinery of judgment. Detroit was gone, but there was a city in front of him. He had always known what to do with a city. The cursed earth began where Megacity One's will to maintain the fiction of civilization ended. There was no dramatic border, no wall, no gate, no ceremonial threshold marking the transition from the city's brutal order into the wasteland's honest chaos. There was simply a point, visible from the sector house roof at dawn if the acid smog was thin enough, where the mega-block construction stopped and the earth began, and the earth was the color of things that had been burned and never recovered. Waya stretching west and south under a sky that carried the particular yellow-gray tint of atmosphere that had absorbed more punishment than atmosphere was designed to absorb and had developed a kind of institutional grudge about it. RoboCop stood on the sector house roof at 0600 hours and looked at it. He had been in Mega City 1 for 53 hours. In that time, he had been assessed, reassessed, scanned by tech division with equipment that his own systems identified as sophisticated enough to be professionally respectful of, and interviewed by two side division judges whose particular brand of evaluative attention, a sustained, careful regard that went several layers deeper than observation, he had found unexpectedly familiar. He had been poked at by a judge tutor named Guthrie, who seemed to regard him as a fascinating administrative problem. He had eaten nothing, because he no longer needed to, and had stood in his assigned quarters for 4 hours in something that was not sleep and was not wakefulness, and was the closest his systems came to the human act of lying in the dark and thinking. He had thought about Detroit. Then he had stopped thinking about Detroit, because Detroit was not a productive operational variable, and he had learned in the years since OCP had rebuilt him that grief processed more efficiently when it was assigned a category and filed, rather than revisited repeatedly without new data. He had filed it. It stayed filed for approximately 40 minutes at a time. Dredd arrived on the roof at 0607. He was in full uniform. RoboCop had not yet seen him in anything else, and was beginning to suspect the answer to that was architectural rather than habitual, that the uniform was not something Dredd put on, but something Dredd was, the way a load-bearing wall was not something a building wore. "You've been up here since 0530, Dredd said. It was not a question. The sector house had surveillance on the roof. Of course it did. "I was looking at the cursed earth," RoboCop said. "Most people don't look at it that long. There's nothing out there worth studying." "There are people out there." Dredd stood beside him and looked at the wasteland with the expression of a man for whom the cursed earth was an operational fact rather than a philosophical provocation. Refugees, muties, outlaws, scavengers. People who couldn't survive in the city and can't survive out there either, mostly. The ones who make it are the ones dangerous enough that the city was better off without them. And the ones who aren't dangerous? They don't last long enough to matter strategically. RoboCop was quiet for a moment. "In Detroit," he said, "there were neighborhoods that the department had effectively stopped patrolling. Not officially. Officially, every citizen was entitled to equal protection. But practically," he paused, "practically OCP's revenue projections had identified certain zip codes as non-viable for the Delta City redevelopment plan. The officers who worked those precincts understood, without anyone saying it directly, that their clearance rates in those areas would not affect their performance reviews." Dredd looked at him. "You're describing resource allocation." "I'm describing the same thing you just described. Different vocabulary." A pause. The acid smog shifted over the cursed earth, and something moved far out in it, too distant to identify, moving with the low, urgent purpose of something that understood it was visible and did not like it. "There's a reason I'm up here," Dredd said. Not quite a segue, more like a decision to move forward rather than engage with the place the conversation had arrived at. "Holloway has approved a supervised field assessment. Chief Judge's office wants operational data before they determine your status. Observation alone isn't generating sufficient basis for a ruling. They want to see what I do. They want to see what you do when things go wrong. Why anyone can follow protocol in a controlled environment." He looked at the cursed earth. There's a situation developing in the outer sectors. Sector 314, it borders the wasteland. We've had reports of a new trafficking operation using cursed earth routes to move contraband into the city. Spikes, umpty, some militarized hardware that tech division hasn't fully classified yet. The operation is sophisticated enough that it's avoided 3 separate Justice Department sweeps in the last 6 weeks. Sophisticated how? They have advance warning of judge movements, which means either a compromised communication channel or a source inside the Justice Department. Dredd said this with the flatness of a man who had encountered both possibilities before and found neither of them surprising or acceptable. HYM, the sweep teams have been rotating personnel to limit exposure. It hasn't helped. You think I'm useful because I'm outside the compromised channel, RoboCop said. I have no connection to Justice Department communications infrastructure. No one inside the operation can warn their source about me because their source doesn't know I exist. You're not a judge, Dredd said, with the particular inflection of someone identifying a quality that had just shifted from liability to asset. For the first time since you arrived, that's operationally useful. RoboCop processed this with a thoroughness he applied to information that carried multiple simultaneous implications. He was being offered fieldwork. He was being offered it specifically because he was an outsider, a variable outside the system's normal parameters, which was precisely what had made him a problem in the assessment room 2 days ago and was now making him a solution. The logic was clean. The discomfort underneath it was the kind his human residue generated when he recognized that he was valued for his alienness rather than his competence, and that the two things were, in this moment, inseparable. He recognized the discomfort. He filed it. It would stay filed for approximately 40 minutes. The cursed earth routes, he said. The trafficking operation is moving product through the wasteland to avoid sector checkpoints. Confirmed. They're using a staging point somewhere in the dead zone between sectors 312 and 314. Our aerial surveillance can't pin it. They're using the old highway overpass network for cover, and the cursed Earth's electromagnetic interference degrades H-wagon sensor packages at range. Dredd's jaw set with the particular tension of a man describing a problem that offended his professional sensibility. We need ground-level intelligence, which means someone goes out there. Into the cursed Earth. Into the cursed Earth. RoboCop looked at the wasteland, at its burned ochre expanse in its yellow sky and the distant moving shape that had resolved itself, in his optical magnification, into a group of 4 figures moving east with the burdened, determined shuffle of people who had been walking for a very long time and had not yet decided whether to be relieved or afraid that the city was getting closer. My systems will operate in the electromagnetic interference environment, he said. I was designed for Detroit. Detroit had significant electromagnetic interference. Industrial primarily, rather than whatever generates it out there. Radiation, old war materiel. The Sovs dropped everything they had on the eastern seaboard before the atom war ended. The cursed Earth is what a landscape looks like after it absorbs a century of that. My shielding should handle it. I was built to function in chemically and radiologically compromised environments. A pause. OCP wanted a product that could be deployed anywhere. It was, to their credit, a thorough design specification. You say that like it bothers you, being thorough by design. It bothers me, RoboCop said carefully, when I remember that the thoroughness was in service of a product, not a person. He looked at Dredd. You were also designed, Judge. The Academy of Law. 5 years. Everything you are was shaped by an institution with specific operational goals. He paused. Does that bother you? Dredd was quiet long enough that RoboCop had begun to conclude the question would go unanswered, which was itself a form of answer. What bothers me, Dredd said finally, is when the design and the law point in different directions. The Academy taught me to be the law. Most of the time, those are the same thing. His tone carried the weight of the qualifier. When they aren't, I follow the law. Even against the Academy. Against the Justice Department itself? I've done it before. RoboCop filed this alongside the admission in the assessment room that the institution and the law had not always been the same thing, and found that his assessment of Judge Dredd was developing in directions that his preliminary evaluation had not fully anticipated. He had expected rigidity. He had found something more architecturally complex, a man who had built his identity on an absolute, the law, precisely because it gave him a fixed point from which to navigate the inevitable moments when everything institutional proved insufficient. He understood this, more than he had expected to. "When do we leave?" RoboCop asked. 800. You'll ride with me to the sector boundary. Beyond that, the lawmaster's too visible. They'll have spotters, and when we go on foot into the dead zone." Dredd looked at him with the evaluative regard that seemed to be his default setting. "Your weight on the wasteland terrain. The ground out there isn't stable. Subsidence from old tunnel networks, in sinkholes, radiation-weakened soil over old blast craters. 300 pounds moving at any speed will generate significant ground vibration. I can modulate my gait, distribute the impact load differently." A pause. "I was a police officer before OCP rebuilt me. I know how to move quietly when it matters." "You were a police officer," Dredd said. "Now you're—" He stopped. The sentence hung in the megacity one morning, incomplete, and Dredd looked mildly irritated at himself for leaving it that way. "Still a police officer," RoboCop said quietly. "That's what I've determined. Whatever else OCP made me, at whatever else I am, the officer was there first. The rest was added. You don't stop being what you were first just because something was built on top of it." Dredd looked at him for a long moment. "Oh, 800, he said, and went back inside. RoboCop remained on the roof for 11 more minutes, which was 9 minutes longer than any operational purpose required. He watched the 4 distant figures reach the city's edge and be met by 2 judges who had clearly been dispatched to that location. Efficient, practiced. The refugees processed with the speed of a system that had done this 10,000 times and would do it 10,000 more. The city absorbed them. The city absorbed everything eventually. He turned from the cursed earth and went to prepare for 0800. In the trafficking operations staging post, 17 kilometers west-southwest, were beneath 300 meters of collapsed highway overpass, in a bunker that had been built during the Atom War for purposes its builders had not survived to complete, a communications device received a signal. The signal was from inside Sector House 9. It contained 4 words. "They're sending something new." The man who read it was not alarmed. In his experience, new things sent by the Justice Department were still Justice Department things, and Justice Department things had patterns that could be learned, exploited, and eventually used to redirect the very system that generated them. He had been doing this for 3 years. He was very good at it. He typed a response. 4 words. Find out what first. He set the device down and went back to his inventory. And the bunker hummed around him with the low electrical patience of an operation that had survived this long by treating every new variable as information rather than threat. 17 kilometers east, a lawmaster's engine turned over in Sector House 9's vehicle bay. 800 was coming. The cursed earth smelled like the memory of fire. Not active combustion, nothing so vital or immediate, something older and more permanent. The scorched mineral residue of energy released at scales that the atmosphere had absorbed and never fully metabolized, baked into the soil over a century of radiation, slow decay until the Earth itself had developed a chemical signature that RoboCop's environmental sensors flagged as hazardous and his processing systems noted as academically extraordinary. This was what happened to Ground Zero when Ground Zero was everywhere. This was what a continent smelled like after it had been used as an argument. They had left the lawmaster at the sector boundary under a collapsed overpass strut, concealed with the practiced economy of a man who had hidden vehicles in worse places and expected to return to them. The transition from Megacity 1's engineered surfaces to the cursed Earth's broken ground had taken 40 seconds and felt like stepping between centuries. Behind them, the megablocks rose against the smog line. Ahead, nothing rose at all. The landscape was relentlessly horizontal, interrupted only by the skeletal remnants of pre-war infrastructure that jutted from the earth at wrong angles, like bones from a wound that had never properly closed. RoboCop had modulated his gait as promised. 293 pounds distributed across a modified stride pattern that elongated his footfall and reduced ground pressure per square inch to something approaching the impact signature of a large man in heavy combat gear. It was not silent, but it was quieter than Dredd had expected, And Dredd's expression, or the set of his jaw beneath the visor, which functioned as expression, indicated that he was revising certain preliminary assessments without announcing the revision. They moved in practiced silence. Dredd knew the cursed earth the way surgeons knew anatomy, not with affection, but with the thorough, unsentimental familiarity of someone who had operated in it enough times to understand where it would try to kill you and how. He picked their route through the subsidence field south of the old highway network with the automatic confidence of accumulated experience, and RoboCop followed his line precisely, his ground-penetrating sonar pinging the tunnel network beneath them and flagging 3 separate instability zones that Dredd's own route had already avoided. "You're using sonar," Dredd said. Not a question. He had apparently detected the emission, which told RoboCop something about the sensitivity of whatever scanning equipment was built into the judge's equipment. "Ground penetrating, short range. There's a tunnel network beneath us. Pre-war construction, partially collapsed. I'm mapping the stable sections." "I know about the tunnels." "Then you know the eastern branch has had a recent collapse within the last 72 hours. A fresh subsidence debris on the western side of the main shaft. Something heavy moved through it recently." Dredd stopped, looked at him. "You can determine recency from sonar return data? Density differential between settled and disturbed material. The debris on the western edge hasn't compacted. It's recent." RoboCop looked at the ground beneath them as though he could see through it, which functionally he could. Something came through the eastern branch from the wasteland side. It was heavy enough to destabilize the partial collapse. Then it moved toward the city boundary. "That's not in any of our sweep team reports." "No," RoboCop said. "It wouldn't be." They altered course without discussion, moving south-southeast along the tunnel network's map trajectory. RoboCop updating the sonar picture in real time and translating it into directional data that he communicated with the economy of someone who had learned to brief under field conditions. Short, precise, sequenced by operational priority. Dredd received it the same way, adjusting their route with the fluid efficiency of a man who had been taking field intelligence from partners for 3 decades and knew how to integrate it without breaking stride. It struck RoboCop moving through the cursed earth's broken silence beside a judge who had stopped questioning his data and started using it, that this was the first time since his arrival that the word partner had occurred to him in a professional context. He filed it under observations requiring further evaluation. And the staging post revealed itself gradually, not as a structure but as an absence. A section of the collapsed highway overpass network where the decay pattern was wrong. Too uniform, the debris distribution suggesting deliberate placement rather than natural collapse. The angle of fallen struts arranged to create overhead cover rather than simply having fallen. Someone had worked with the ruin rather than against it. Someone with patience, engineering knowledge, and a clear understanding that the best concealment was concealment that looked like it had been there forever. RoboCop stopped 30 meters out and held a closed fist at shoulder height, a gesture from a gestural vocabulary that should have meant nothing to Dredd, and that Dredd responded to instantly, not freezing mid-stride with the reflexive precision of someone whose body had been trained to read tactical signals regardless of their origin. 7 heat signatures, RoboCop said, voice dropped to the minimum volume his speaker system could produce while remaining intelligible. Inside the overpass structure, 4 in a central chamber, seated, clustered, consistent with a meeting or transaction. 2 at what appear to be access points. Guards, stationary. 1 moving, patrol pattern, northeastern perimeter. Armament. The 4 in the central chamber. At least 2 carry what my systems flag as military-grade energy weapons. Inconsistent with any Justice Department catalog I've been given access to. The guards at the access points have conventional projectile weapons. The patrol, he paused. His targeting system ran a secondary analysis. The patrol is carrying something I cannot fully classify. The energy signature is significant. My systems are suggesting it may be the unclassified hardware your tech division mentioned. Dredd was very still. Can you get a clearer read? Not at this range without increasing the sonar emission to a level they'd likely detect. I need to be closer. A pause. 10 meters. I can get a full classification at 10 meters. 10 meters puts you within visual range of the Northeastern Patrol. Yes, the patrol has unclassified hardware. Yes, and you want to walk to within 10 meters of it. RoboCop looked at Dredd. I've been shot with most thing, he said. It's useful data. The sound Dredd made was not quite identifiable. One, it occupied a narrow acoustic territory somewhere between professional disapproval and something that, in a man with a more expressive face, might have indicated reluctant appreciation of a particular kind of operational recklessness that he recognized because he practiced it himself. We go together, Dredd said. I take the Northeastern Patrol. You get your reading. If you take the patrol, the others will know, not if I take them quietly. He looked at RoboCop with the expression of a man who had been underestimated so many times that he had stopped finding it worth remarking on. I've been doing this since before you arrived, Murphy. It was the first time Dredd had used his name. Not his designation, not the machine or the unit or the careful bureaucratic distance of the entity. His name. RoboCop processed the significance of this in approximately 0.3 seconds, and then processed why he was processing the significance of it, which took slightly longer. Murphy, he said, that's your name, unless you prefer the designation. Murphy is fine, he said. And then because something in his human residue felt the weight of it being used in this broken landscape under this poison sky, he added, it's been a while since anyone used it. Dredd said nothing. He was already moving, low and silent, northeast, with the particular quality of stillness in motion that RoboCop's sensors tracked as an almost architectural phenomenon. A man so precisely controlled in his movement that the air around him barely registered the displacement. For his size in this terrain, it was remarkable. RoboCop made a note of it in his assessment file and began his own approach, southwest toward the 10-meter threshold. He reached it in 40 seconds. The unclassified hardware resolved in his targeting system with the clarity of close-range analysis, and his processors ran the classification 3 times before accepting the result. Because the result was alarming in ways that revised several assumptions about the sophistication of whoever was running this operation. It was not simply militarized contraband. It was a directed energy platform, compact, shoulder-mounted, with a power cell that his systems identified as derived from Justice Department H-Wagon propulsion technology. Someone had taken apart at least 2 Justice Department aerial vehicles, extracted their power systems, and constructed weapons from the components, which meant the trafficking operation had access to Justice Department hardware, which meant the compromised channel ran deeper than a communications leak. He was framing the tactical implications of this when the Northeastern Patrol's body hit the ground with the muffled, terminal efficiency of a man who had been neutralized so quickly that the sound of it was largely theoretical. And Dredd was moving back toward him from the northeast with the economy of someone for whom violence, when necessary, was a precision instrument rather than an event. Well, Dredd said, arriving at his shoulder, they have Justice Department hardware, H-Wagon propulsion cells, repurposed as directed energy weapons. RoboCop watched Dredd absorb this, watched the jaw tighten, watched the stillness that settled over him. Not surprise exactly, but the particular quality of controlled anger that a man develops when he discovers that something he has dedicated his life to protecting has been used against what he's protecting it for. Someone with access to Justice Department equipment disposal or maintenance, or someone who can intercept decommissioned vehicles before they're processed. Dredd's voice was flat in the way that flat voices got when they were covering significant internal pressure. There's a maintenance depot in Sector 309. Decommissioned H-Wagons are held there before processing. We've had 3 go missing in the last 8 months, logged as administrative errors. Administrative errors, RoboCop said. Administrative errors, Dredd repeated, in with the exact inflection of a man who was going to have a specific conversation with a specific administrator that would be significantly less pleasant than any previous conversation that administrator had experienced. The 4 in the central chamber, RoboCop said, returning to immediate operational priority. The transaction or meeting, I need to know if it's still active or concluded. If they're mid-transaction, interrupting now gives us both parties. If it's concluded, we lose one side. Dredd was already assessing angles. his head moving in the small, precise arcs of a man mapping an approach. Two access points. I take one, you take the other, simultaneously. The element of surprise gives us approximately 4 seconds before the central chamber responds. 4 seconds is sufficient. For me, so for you? RoboCop considered his Auto 9, his chassis capability, his current operational environment, and the 7 targets whose behavioral patterns he had been mapping for the last 3 minutes. 3, he said. Dredd looked at him. 3 seconds. I prefer to be conservative with estimates. The sound that Dredd made this time was definitively identifiable. It was, without question, the sound of a man who had just encountered something he found professionally compatible, filtered through a personality that found compatibility mildly inconvenient because it complicated a simpler operational picture. They moved. The access points were 19 meters apart. RoboCop took the western one, a gap in the collapsed overpass material that had been reinforced with salvaged metal sheeting, now guarded by a man with a projectile weapon and the professional alertness of someone who was good at his job, but had not been trained to expect an armored figure emerging from the cursed Earth's dark at a pace that covered 19 meters in a time that his threat response system couldn't process quickly enough to act on. The Western Guard was neutralized, non-lethally, with the precise application of force to specific points that RoboCop's medical database identified as reliably producing unconsciousness without permanent damage in 1.3 seconds. He was through the access point in 1.9 seconds. The central chamber was roughly circular. The overpass's structural void reinforced into a working space with the improvised competence of people who had been living in the margins long enough to become skilled at it, was 3 crates of contraband hardware, a communications array that his systems immediately began scanning. The 4 figures, 2 seated, 2 standing, all turning toward him with the startled urgency of people whose meeting had just been comprehensively interrupted. The 2 with military-grade energy weapons raised them. RoboCop's targeting system flagged both simultaneously. His Auto 9 was already in his hand. Weapons down, he said. Justice Department. One of them, quick, smart, reading the situation with the accurate instincts of someone who had survived in this business by knowing when a fight was winnable, lowered his weapon. The other fired. The energy discharge hit RoboCop in the chest plate. His systems registered it as significant, more significant than conventional projectile weapons. Ever heat and force combination that his chassis absorbed, but that his sensors noted had produced a 12% integrity reduction in his left thoracic armor section. He filed the damage assessment. He filed the weapon's power output data. He filed the fact that OCP's engineers had built him to take considerably more than that before his operational capacity began to degrade. He crossed the chamber in 2 strides and removed the weapon from the man who had fired it with the same precise economy he applied to everything. And the man found himself on the floor without entirely understanding how the transition had occurred. Dredd came through the eastern access point 4 seconds after RoboCop had entered the western one. 4 seconds being, apparently, what Dredd required, which was 1 second more than RoboCop's conservative estimate, and which Dredd would not mention and neither would RoboCop. The chamber was secured, 4 individuals in custody, the communications array still active, still cycling through encrypted channels that RoboCop systems were already beginning to map. And on the array's most recent transmission log, an outgoing signal, sent 40 minutes ago, to a receiver inside Megacity 1, to a receiver inside Sector House 9. Dredd looked at the transmission log. Then he looked at RoboCop. The leak, RoboCop said. Yes. Someone in your sector house knew we were coming. Yes. The jaw, the stillness, the controlled architectural anger. And they warned the operation anyway, which means they didn't know you'd be with me, which means their intelligence about your movements is good. Their intelligence about variables outside the department's normal communication channels is not. RoboCop looked at the array. We have the signal's origin coordinates. We have the transmission timestamp. We have enough to identify the source. Dredd was very still for a long moment, in the way that men go still when they're about to do something they know will cost them something they value. This stays between us, he said, until we know who it is. If we run it through department channels, We warned them, RoboCop said. I understand. Dredd looked at him with the evaluative regard that had become familiar. But something in it had shifted. The evaluation was still there. The distance that had structured it was not quite as absolute. You understand a lot, Dredd said. For someone who's been here 53 hours. Corruption is the same in every city, RoboCop said. That's the one thing that never requires translation. Outside, the cursed earth stretched on under its yellow sky, patient and indifferent. 17 kilometers east, Megacity 1 hummed with its 800 million lives and its grinding machinery of law. Somewhere inside that machinery, something had gone wrong in the way that things went wrong when people decided the law was a resource to be extracted rather than a principle to be kept. RoboCop had spent his entire operational existence dealing with exactly that problem. He was, for the first time since arriving in this city, operating in entirely familiar territory. The Council of Five met in a room that did not officially exist. This was not unusual in Megacity 1. The city's 800 million residents generated governance structures the way it generated everything else. In excess, in layers, with the organic inevitability of systems too large and too complex to be fully visible to any single observer. The Justice Department was the law's public face. Judges on the streets, H-wagons in the sky, ISO cubes processing the city's endless criminal output with the mechanical patience of an institution that had long since stopped being surprised by human behavior. But beneath the Justice Department's visible architecture, in the spaces between official mandate and operational reality, other structures existed. Advisory bodies, oversight committees, the civilian remnants of pre-justice democratic governance, preserved in amber by political compromise and institutional inertia, performing functions that the Chief Judge's office found useful precisely because they were deniable. The Council of Five was the most deniable of these structures and the most useful. 5 seats, 5 representatives drawn from Megacity 1's most significant non-justice institutional powers, the Megacity Commerce Authority, the Housing and Mega Block Administration, the Municipal Medical Directorate, the Communications Oversight Board, and a seat held, by tradition so old that its origin had become obscure, by a representative of what the official record listed as independent civil society, and what everyone in the room understood to mean the organized interests of the city's most significant criminal enterprises, laundered through enough legitimate business infrastructure that the legal distinction had become more philosophical than practical. The current holder of that 5th seat was a woman named Carla Dressler, 51 years old. Legitimate biography, founder and chief executive of Dressler Municipal Services, a waste processing and infrastructure maintenance conglomerate that held contracts across 47 sectors. Actual biography, the most sophisticated criminal logistics operator Megacity 1 had produced in 20 years, whose organization had survived 3 chief judges, 2 chaos days, and 11 separate Justice Department investigations, by the simple expedient of being so deeply embedded in the city's functional infrastructure that removing her would have disrupted services to approximately 90 million residents. She was, higher by any operational measure, untouchable. She was also, RoboCop had determined from 47 minutes of analysis of the communications array's archived transmission data, the Council of Five meetings host. The council met in a room beneath the Dressler Municipal Services Administrative Tower in Sector 7, a building whose waste processing infrastructure created electromagnetic interference dense enough to degrade Justice Department surveillance equipment to the point of operational uselessness, a fact that Dressler had ensured when she'd personally overseen the building's construction 18 years ago, and that she had maintained with the careful attention of someone who understood that the difference between untouchable and merely very difficult to touch was often a single piece of evidence arriving at the wrong moment. A RoboCop stood in Dredd's office in Sector House 9, a room that matched its occupant in the sense that it contained exactly what was required and nothing that wasn't, and laid out the intelligence architecture that 47 minutes of analysis had produced. Dredd stood at the window looking at the sector's street-level churn and listened with the focused stillness of a man building a tactical picture. The trafficking operation in the cursed earth is logistics infrastructure, RoboCop said. The contraband hardware, The directed energy weapons built from H-Wagon components, those aren't the product. They're payment. Dressler's organization is providing the Justice Department mole with equipment access in exchange for advance warning of sweep operations. The mole identifies decommissioned H-Wagons scheduled for processing. Each diverts them through administrative error categorization, and Dressler's people collect them from the maintenance depot in Sector 309 before processing occurs. 3 H-Wagons in 8 months, Dredd said without turning from the window. The fourth was scheduled for processing in 11 days. My projections suggest the mole would have diverted it within the next 72 hours. RoboCop paused. The communications array in the Cursed Earth staging post transmitted to 7 distinct receivers inside the city. 6 are Dressler organizational contacts. I've been able to map them from the transmission metadata. The 7th is inside the Justice Department, is inside Sector House 9. The transmission coordinates narrow to this building with a precision that my systems cannot refine further without access to your internal communications architecture. He looked at Dredd's back. I need access to your internal systems to identify the source. Dredd turned from the window. You're asking for access to Justice Department internal communications. I'm asking for access to the specific data that will identify which of the 32 judges in this sector house is feeding operational intelligence to a criminal organization that is equipping its contractors with weapons built from your own department's hardware. RoboCop held the pause for exactly long enough to let the operational logic settle. I understand the sensitivity. I'm not asking for broad access. I'm asking for transmission metadata from the sector house's internal communication logs for the period covering our departure this morning. That requires Chief Judge authorization. It requires someone with authorization to request it. I don't have that standing. He looked at Dredd steadily. You do. Dredd was quiet. The city noise filtered through the window behind him. The perpetual white noise roar of 800 million people living in compressed proximity, punctuated by the distant wail of a Justice Department siren moving through its Doppler arc somewhere in the sector's middle distance. If I request that authorization, Dredd said slowly, through normal channels, whoever leaked our movements this morning will have access to the request before it's processed. Yes, which means I can't request it through normal channels. No, which means I need to go above normal channels, directly to the Chief Judge's office, bypassing Sector House 9's communication infrastructure entirely. He looked at RoboCop with the expression of a man identifying an operational problem that was also a political one. That will be noticed. The Chief Judge's office receiving a direct contact from a sector judge, bypassing sector command, will generate questions. Yes, RoboCop said, it will. And whoever is watching for those questions, whoever in this building is feeding Dressler's operation, will know that something has changed, that the investigation has reached a level they didn't anticipate. He paused. That is, and in fact the objective. Dredd looked at him. We flush them, RoboCop said. A direct contact to the Chief Judge's office creates pressure. Dressler's mole, knowing that the investigation has escalated beyond sector level, will attempt to communicate with her. They'll use whatever secondary channel they've established. Something outside the sector house's normal infrastructure. Something we haven't identified yet. When they do, he let the implication complete itself. We're watching for it, Dredd said. I can watch for it. My systems can monitor the electromagnetic environment around this building for transmission signatures consistent with the metadata from the Cursed Earth array. If there's a secondary channel operating in or near this sector house, I'll find it. A pause. But you need to make the contact first. And you need to do it in a way that guarantees it will be noticed by whoever in this building is watching for it. Dredd was very still for a long moment. Then he walked to his desk, picked up his direct line comm, the secure channel that bypassed sector infrastructure, and connected to Justice Department command, and looked at it with the expression of a man who understood exactly what he was about to set in motion and had decided, with characteristic absence of hesitation, to set it in motion anyway. When this is over, he said, and whoever it is has been identified and processed, there will be an ISO cube sentence. No exceptions, no mitigating circumstances. No. I know, RoboCop said. You don't have a problem with that. A judge who sells operational intelligence to a criminal organization that uses it to arm contractors with weapons built from your own department's hardware. RoboCop's voice carried no heat, no judgment, no moralizing register. Just the flat, specific weight of a man stating an operational conclusion. No, I don't have a problem with that. Dredd looked at him for a moment longer. Then he opened the channel. The conversation with the chief judge's office took 4 minutes. Dredd was precise, specific, and entirely without the diplomatic softening that might have made the request easier to process institutionally. He stated what he had found, what he required, and what he believed was at stake with the economy of someone who had learned that clarity was more efficient than courtesy in situations where both were unavailable simultaneously. The chief judge's representative, a senior judge named Castillo, whose voice carried the careful neutrality of someone managing significant information professionally, confirmed that the authorization would be processed through a dedicated secure channel outside Sector House 9's infrastructure. Timeline: 2 hours. Dredd closed the channel. RoboCop was already monitoring. The Sector House's electromagnetic environment was complex. 32 judges, their equipment, the building's own communication and security infrastructure, the ambient city noise bleeding through the structure's exterior walls. He was filtering it layer by layer, separating the known from the anomalous, building a baseline picture of normal transmission activity against which a secondary channel would eventually contrast. It took 11 minutes. The transmission was brief. 8 seconds of encrypted data burst, origin point consistent with the Sector House's eastern residential wing, the residential quarters where off-duty judges maintained their minimal personal space. The encryption was good, not good enough to prevent his systems from logging the transmission signature's metadata, which was consistent with the Cursed Earth Array's outgoing signal profile. He had the location. He had the transmission signature. He did not yet have the content or the sender's identity. That would require the chief judge's authorization to access internal records. But he had something else. Something that his experience of police work, accumulated across years of Detroit service before and after OCP's reconstruction, told him was often more operationally valuable than a clean forensic chain. He had the timestamp. And the timestamp placed the transmission at 11.7 seconds after Dredd had closed the chief judge's channel. 11.7 seconds. The time required for someone monitoring the Sector House's internal communication traffic to detect the chief judge's direct channel being opened, process its significance, and initiate a warning transmission to Dressler's organization. 11.7 seconds was a very short reaction time. It was the reaction time of someone who had been watching, who had been ready, who had known before today, and that their position was potentially compromised and had prepared for exactly this contingency. "Dredd," RoboCop said. Dredd looked up from the tactical display he'd been reviewing. "Whoever this is, they're not panicking. They're executing a contingency plan. They were prepared for this scenario." He looked at Dredd steadily. This isn't someone who drifted into corruption incrementally. This was a deliberate, structured arrangement from the beginning. The mole was placed, not turned. The word placed settled into the room with the particular weight of words that reframe everything they touch. Dredd's jaw set in the way it set when he was moving from assessment to action. A transition that RoboCop had learned to recognize as reliably as a tactical indicator. "Dressler," Dredd said. "She needed someone inside the Sector House. Someone with access to operational communications and H-Wagon maintenance scheduling. She didn't wait for an opportunity to compromise an existing judge." RoboCop paused. "She built the opportunity, which means this goes back further than the trafficking operation, further than the 3 missing H-Wagons. This was infrastructure, built over time, maintained carefully." "How far back?" Dredd said. RoboCop ran the calculation against the transmission metadata, the maintenance depot diversion records, the Council of Five's known operational history, and a set of inferences that his processing architecture was careful to flag as inferences rather than conclusions. "At least 4 years," he said. "Possibly longer." Dredd stood at his window again. The city churned below, are indifferent to the specific shape of what was being assembled in this room. The understanding that something had been living inside his sector house for 4 years, patient and prepared, serving interests that were the precise inverse of everything he had dedicated his existence to. RoboCop watched him process it, watched the stillness that wasn't absence, but was the particular quality of a man who had encountered the worst thing available and was not broken by it because he had spent his entire life building the kind of structure inside himself that the worst available things could not break. He recognized this too. He recognized it the way you recognize something you had needed to build in yourself for reasons you did not choose. "What do you need from me?" Dredd said finally. "It's access to the residential wing surveillance archive for the last 48 hours, without routing the request through sector house infrastructure." RoboCop paused. "In your judgment, when we have a name, because when we have a name, what happens next will be your call, not mine. This is your house." Dredd looked at him. Something in the look had changed, not softened, because Dredd did not soften, but shifted, the way a fixed point shifts when the thing it's been measuring moves and the measurement updates accordingly. "You could make that call yourself," Dredd said. "You have the capability." "I have the capability," RoboCop agreed. "I don't have the jurisdiction, and jurisdiction matters." He paused. "That's one of the things I learned in Detroit, the hard way, more than once." The city hummed below them. The 2-hour clock ran toward its conclusion, and somewhere in the sector house's eastern residential wing, someone was waiting with a contingency plan and 4 years of careful architecture, not knowing that 11.7 seconds had already told them everything their pursuers needed to know. The name was Quinlan. Judge Sergeant Petra Quinlan. 12 years of service, commendations for the Sector 9 block war suppression, the Umpty Candy distribution bust of 2139, and distinguished conduct during the Chaos Day anniversary riots 3 years prior. A service record so clean and so consistently distinguished that it had become, RoboCop noted as he reviewed it, its own form of camouflage. In an institution that promoted on merit and documented everything, a perfect record was the best possible cover, because the first thing any investigation eliminated was the person with no reason to be investigated. Quinlan had been placed 12 years ago. The chief judge's authorization had arrived 90 minutes after Dredd's direct channel request, processed through a dedicated secure line that had bypassed Sector House 9's infrastructure entirely, and arrived on Dredd's personal comm unit as a compressed data package that RoboCop had spent 11 minutes decrypting with the authorization codes Dredd provided. The residential wing surveillance archive, once accessed, had told the story with the impersonal thoroughness of recorded evidence. Quinlan, at her personal comm unit, 11.7 seconds after Dredd's channel closed, the transmission burst lasting 8 seconds, her expression carrying the particular focused calm of someone executing a practice procedure rather than responding to a crisis. 12 years. Placed at the Academy of Law level, RoboCop's analysis suggested Dressler's organization identifying a candidate, facilitating her recruitment in ways that the Academy's intake process hadn't been designed to detect, because the Academy had been designed to screen for corruption in candidates, not to screen for candidates who had been engineered for corruption before they arrived. It was elegant in the way that patient, structural criminality was always elegant. RoboCop had seen it in Detroit, the long-game infiltration of institutions by interests that understood the institution better than the institution understood itself. OCP had done something similar to Metro Division. Only the methodology was universal, only the uniforms changed. Dredd reviewed the surveillance archive footage twice. He said nothing during either viewing. When it finished the second time, he set the comm unit on his desk with the careful deliberateness of a man ensuring that the object he was setting down would not be damaged, because he was applying considerable internal force to the act of setting it down carefully. "How do you want to proceed?" RoboCop asked. "I want to go to her quarters and tell her she's under arrest." Flat, immediate. "That's what I want. If you do that now, before we've traced her communication channel to Dressler's organization, we close one end of the connection and leave the other intact." RoboCop paused. "Dressler knows something has changed. Her mole has warned her. Wait, she's already adjusting her operational posture. If we take Quinlan now without completing the chain to Dressler..." Dressler walks. Dredd said it the way you said things you already knew and didn't want confirmed. Dressler walks, and in 6 months or a year or 4 years, she places someone else. The silence in the room had a specific weight. It was the silence of a man confronting the gap between what justice required immediately and what justice required completely, and finding the gap wider than the immediate requirement could bridge. RoboCop understood this silence. He had lived in variations of it for most of his operational existence. The space between what the law demanded right now and what the law would require you to sacrifice to make right now meaningful. OCP had tried to fill that gap with Directive 4, and with programming that turned the gap itself into a weapon aimed at the people it was supposed to protect. He had found his way around that. He had found his way back to the law, but the gap had never closed entirely. It never did. There's a Council of Five meeting, RoboCop said. Dressler's meeting. My analysis of the communications array data puts the next scheduled meeting at 41 hours from now. The transmission Quinlan sent will have included a status update. Dressler will accelerate the fourth H-Wagon diversion. She'll want to extract maximum value from the mole's position before the situation deteriorates further. He looked at Dredd. If we let Quinlan run for 41 hours with surveillance on her secondary channel, we can follow the operational thread directly to the Council of Five meeting. We take Dressler mid-transaction. We close both ends simultaneously. 41 hours of letting a corrupt judge operate inside my sector house. 41 hours of a corrupt judge operating under total surveillance, unable to cause operational harm because every communication she makes is being monitored, and every action she takes is being anticipated. RoboCop held Dredd's gaze. She can't warn Dressler of anything we don't want Dressler to know. We control the information she has access to. We feed her what we want Dressler to believe, and we feed it at the pace that moves Dressler toward the Council of Five meeting. Dredd stared at him for a long moment. You're describing using a corrupt judge as an intelligence instrument against the organization she serves. Yes, while she believes she's still operating. While she believes that her warning transmission was successful and that Dressler's organization is adjusting accordingly, which from her perspective it will appear to be. RoboCop paused. We don't lie to her. We simply ensure that what she observes is what we want her to report. She makes her own conclusions. She transmits them. We learn Dressler's response in real time. Dredd stood very still. This is not standard judicial procedure. No, RoboCop said. It isn't. Judges don't run informants in this manner. The legal framework for Dredd. RoboCop said it quietly, without force, without urgency. Just the name and the weight of what was behind it. I know what standard procedure looks like. I know what it produces. And I know what it costs when the people who benefit from standard procedure have spent 12 years learning exactly where standard procedure's edges are. He paused. Dressler built this operation inside the margins of what standard procedure can reach. You cannot close those margins with standard procedure. You need something she hasn't planned for. Another silence. Longer this time. You, Dredd said. Something outside the system she's mapped. RoboCop looked at him steadily. I'm not suggesting we abandon the law. I'm suggesting we use it more completely than she's accounted for. Every step documented, every decision justified. Clean chain of evidence from Quinlan's transmission to Dressler's arrest. A pause. But we don't announce the chain until it's complete. For that's not corruption. That's investigation. Dredd looked at the comm unit on his desk, at the surveillance footage frozen on its screen. Quinlan's face, composed and professional, executing her 8-second transmission with the practiced calm of 12 years of preparation. If this goes wrong, he said, if Dressler is warned through a channel we haven't identified and she goes to ground, this decision is on record. Mine and yours. Yes, RoboCop said. It is. You're comfortable with that? I've had decisions on record before. Most of them were harder than this one. He paused. The ones I regret are the ones where I let the procedure substitute for the judgment, where I followed the directive because it was the directive and found out afterward what the directive was actually serving. A pause. Quinlan served a directive for 12 years. Clean record. Every commendation earned. The directive was wrong from the beginning, and the record didn't change that. Dredd picked up the comm unit, set it back down. The deliberateness of the gesture suggested a decision being made through physical action rather than following from it. 41 hours, he said. We run it your way. Documentation at every step. When we move on the Council of Five, the evidence chain is complete before anyone is touched. He looked at RoboCop. And when it's over, Quinlan goes to the ISO cube. No mitigation. No mitigation, RoboCop agreed immediately. Something in Dredd's expression, the jaws set, the particular quality of his regard, shifted fractionally. Not warmth. Something more architecturally significant than warmth. Would the acknowledgement that recognizes a fixed point in someone else's structure and maps its position for future reference. There's something else, RoboCop said. Dredd waited. Directive 4. He said it carefully because it required care. Not because the words were difficult, but because what they represented was the kind of thing that, once acknowledged, could not be unacknowledged. In my programming, OCP buried a fourth directive beneath the three operational ones. Its function was to prevent me from acting against OCP's executive interests. It was designed to shut me down operationally at the moment I became most useful, when the people I needed to stop were the people who had built me to serve them. Dredd was very still. I found it, RoboCop said. I worked around it. Eventually I removed it, with help. But for a period of my operational existence, I was an instrument of the people I was supposed to investigate. I was used against the city I was supposed to protect, and I didn't know it. He paused. The record during that period was clean. Every directive followed, every procedure observed. The record is not the same thing as the law. The city hummed below them. Somewhere in the eastern residential wing, Quinlan was in her quarters, believing that her contingency transmission had done what it was supposed to do, believing that her 12 years of careful architecture was intact. Why are you telling me this? Dredd said. Because you're about to authorize an operation that requires you to trust my judgment over a 41-hour period in which I will be operating with significant autonomy. RoboCop met his gaze directly. Mach, you should know the full history of the instrument you're authorizing. Everything it was used for. Everything it found its way back from. The silence this time was different from the others. It had the quality of a recalibration, not of trust exactly, because Dredd's trust was not an emotional phenomenon, but a tactical one, a continuous assessment of evidence, rather than a state that was granted or withheld as a permanent condition. Your Directive 4, Dredd said. Is it gone? Yes. Confirmed gone, not suppressed, not worked around. Gone. Confirmed gone. I had it removed by someone I trusted. The removal was not painless, but complete. Dredd was quiet for a moment. The Justice Department has its own version of Directive 4, he said. Not in any judge's programming, in the institution itself. Rules that exist to protect the institution rather than the law. Procedures that were written to serve political interests rather than judicial ones. I've encountered them. His voice carried the weight of specific memory rather than general principle. I've had to work around them. Yes, RoboCop said. I know. You've been watching. I've been learning. He paused. That's what you authorized when you brought me to the cursed earth. Not just tactical utility. You wanted to see how I learned. Dredd said nothing, which was, RoboCop had come to understand, one of Dredd's more precise forms of confirmation. They spent the next 3 hours constructing the operational architecture for the 41-hour window. The surveillance parameters, the controlled information environment, the evidence documentation protocols. Why Dredd worked with the systematic thoroughness of someone who had spent 31 years building cases that would survive legal challenge. And RoboCop worked with the patient precision of someone who understood that clean evidence was the difference between justice and procedure, and that the difference mattered even when, especially when, nobody who needed to be stopped was going to make it easy. At hour 37, Quinlan transmitted again. The content, once decrypted, was a location, a meeting point, a time. 41 hours had become 39. Dressler was moving faster than projected, which meant she was more rattled than she was showing, which meant RoboCop reflected with the particular satisfaction of an investigator watching a subject's behavior confirm a hypothesis. How much that the operation had done exactly what it was designed to do. He looked at Dredd. Dredd looked at the decrypted message. "We move," Dredd said. It was not a question. The meeting point was a place called the Slab, not its official designation. The Mega City 1 Municipal Records Office logged it as Residential Processing Center, 7 Sector 12, a decommissioned intake facility from the city's mid-expansion period that had been closed for structural renovation 14 years ago and had remained suspended in the administrative limbo of a renovation project whose funding had been reallocated, then reallocated again, then quietly absorbed into a budget line that no longer referenced the building it had originally been designated to repair. The city was full of places like this, structures that had fallen through the gaps between institutional attention and institutional memory, existing in a legal and physical gray zone that made them useful to people whose activities benefited from gray zones. The Slab occupied half a block in Sector 12's industrial margin, 7 stories of pre-war ferrocrete construction with the particular solidity of buildings designed for a permanent function that they had outlived. Its windows had been sealed, its access points reduced to 2, the official front entrance, alarmed and monitored by a Justice Department sensor that had been reporting normal readings for 14 years because it had been modified at some point during those 14 years to report whatever Dressler's organization instructed it to report. Point and a service entrance in the building's northwest corner, accessible through a maintenance corridor that the Municipal Records Office had no documentation for because the corridor had been constructed after the building's decommissioning by people who preferred their infrastructure undocumented. RoboCop knew about the service entrance because Quinlan's second transmission had included, embedded in its encrypted payload with the operational specificity of someone who had been briefed thoroughly, a structural schematic of the building's modified interior. He had spent 40 minutes with the schematic and had emerged from it with a tactical picture detailed enough that he could have navigated the slab blindfolded, which was not a capability he possessed, but which represented the thoroughness of his preparation rather than its limit. They approached from the northeast. Dredd had brought 2 judges from outside Sector House 9's regular roster, pulled from Sector 22 on a chief judge authorization that had been routed through the same secure channel as the surveillance archive access, bypassing Sector 9 infrastructure entirely. Judge Sergeants Park and Vance, a woman and a man, both carrying the particular quality of competence that announced itself through the absence of wasted movement, rather than through any dramatic display of readiness. They had been briefed on the operations parameters with the economy of professionals who received briefings well, which was to say they had asked 2 questions each and then stopped asking questions and started preparing. DePark had looked at RoboCop during the briefing with the evaluative attention that RoboCop had become accustomed to receiving in Mega City 1, and then had looked at Dredd, and then had returned to her preparation without visible comment, which was the specific kind of professional acceptance that RoboCop valued more than any explicit statement of welcome would have been. Vance had said with the flat directness of a Mega City 1 judge, for whom social calibration was a lower operational priority than tactical honesty, "You've been here less than a week and you're already running a joint operation with Dredd." A pause. "Most judges take years to get there." "I didn't plan it," RoboCop said. "Nobody does," Vance said, and went back to checking his lawgiver. They held position in the maintenance corridor behind the slab's northeast face at 0215 hours. The corridor dark enough that RoboCop's optical systems had shifted to thermal imaging, the 4 of them rendered in the heat signature palette of his targeting display as 4 sources of biological warmth against the ferrocrete's cool indifference. Dredd was beside him. Park and Vance held the service entrance, 12 meters south, with the stillness of people who were comfortable in dark corridors at 0215 hours, because dark corridors at 0215 hours were a recurring feature of their professional landscape. The Council of 5 meeting had been in progress for 22 minutes. According to the surveillance drone that RoboCop had adapted from a Justice Department traffic monitoring unit, a modification that had required 40 minutes of careful technical work and that the drone's original programming had resisted with the mulish conservatism of systems not designed for creative reinterpretation, but that had ultimately yielded to his processing capability with the grudging capitulation of an argument that runs out of technical objections before its opponent runs out of responses. The drone was circling the slab at 300 meters altitude, its modified sensor package feeding him thermal data from the building's interior in real time. Sixth floor, a space that the building's original plans had designated as a communal processing hall and that had been subdivided at some point in its informal afterlife. I went to a functional meeting room with the structural pragmatism of people who needed a table and four walls and had access to the materials and motivation to produce them. 5 heat signatures, seated, the Council of 5, present in full. 2 additional signatures near the room's entrance, security, armed, stationary. 3 more signatures distributed across the building's lower floors. A patrol pattern, irregular intervals, professional. Carla Dressler's signature was identifiable by position. The head of the table, the thermal profile of a person in a posture of authority, which had its own subtle signature in the way body heat distributed across a frame that was carrying itself with the particular deliberate composure of someone who was managing significant stress through the performance of composure rather than through its actual experience. She knew something had changed. She was managing it. She was doing it well. She had not yet processed that the change was more complete than she believed. 5 on the 6th floor, RoboCop said, his voice below the threshold of the corridor's ambient noise. 2 guards at the room entrance. 3 patrol, lower floors. Patrol interval is approximately 4 minutes. Current position? He checked the drone feed. Northwest quadrant, 2nd floor. We have 3 minutes and 40 seconds before they complete the circuit to our entry point. Dredd absorbed this without response, which was his form of confirmation. He looked at the service entrance, at the corridor ahead, with the focused regard of a man mapping his route through a building he had never entered, and that his training and experience had prepared him to enter anyway. Park Vance, service entrance on my mark. Standard judicial entry, northwest stairwell, ground to 2nd floor containment. Hold the patrol. Do not advance past 2nd floor until I signal. He looked at RoboCop. You and I take the central stairwell to the 6th floor. The 2 guards at the room entrance. I'll handle the approach, RoboCop said. My chassis will absorb whatever they're carrying before they can transition to a more dangerous target. You take the room. Dredd looked at him with the specific quality of attention that the sentence "I'll absorb whatever they're carrying" produced in a professional who understood what that meant operationally and found it both tactically sound and the kind of statement that required a specific category of personal architecture to make with that particular absence of drama. When we enter the room, Dredd said, the council members are detained, not engaged. Dressler is my priority. She does not leave that room without being processed. Understood. If she attempts to access a communication device, I'll prevent it. If she has a weapon, I'll prevent that too. A pause. The corridor's dark hummed with the building's residual electrical infrastructure, aging conduit, the low vibration of systems that had been running on minimal power for 14 years and had developed the mechanical stubbornness of things that outlast their intended operational period through sheer material inertia. Murphy, Dredd said. Yes, in the room. Whatever Dressler says, whatever justification, whatever institutional leverage she attempts to invoke. She is under arrest from the moment we enter. The Council of Five's civilian status does not... I know, RoboCop said. She doesn't get a speech. Something in Dredd's posture adjusted. A fractional change in the set of his shoulders that RoboCop's systems logged as significant without being able to fully categorize its significance. Mark, Dredd said. They moved. The service entrance yielded to Park's override with the resigned ease of security infrastructure that had been installed by people who understood mechanical systems better than electronic ones. The corridor beyond was dark, functional, the floor plan matching RoboCop's schematic with the precision of intelligence that had been constructed by someone who had walked this building more than once. The central stairwell was 3 minutes from the service entrance at a pace that the patrol's position made necessary. Controlled, precise, the kind of movement that traded speed for silence, because the patrol could not be allowed to know that the upper floors were being approached until the upper floors had been secured. RoboCop modulated his gait with the care he had demonstrated in the Cursed Earth. Each footfall placed with the ground pressure distribution of a man who knew that 300 pounds on a ferrocrete stairwell, built in 2089 and unmaintained since 2131, was a structural interaction that required respect. The stairwell held. They reached the sixth floor landing at 0228 hours. The door to the corridor was sealed, a modern lock, incongruous with the building's age, recently installed by people who valued their meetings' privacy at a level that had motivated a hardware investment. RoboCop's systems engaged it with the electronic patience of an interface that had been designed to open locks that were more sophisticated than this one, and the seal released in 8 seconds. The corridor beyond, 40 meters, the meeting room at its far end, light bleeding under the door with the warm, specific quality of a space where people were present and talking. 2 guards flanking the entrance, professional, alert, carrying weapons that his targeting system classified as significant. They saw him immediately. The corridor was 40 meters long, and RoboCop was not small, and he was moving at a pace that did not attempt concealment, because concealment at this point was no longer the operative tactical variable. "Justice Department," he said. His voice in the corridor had the particular quality of a statement made by something that did not need the corridor's acoustics to carry authority, but that used them anyway. "Weapons down." They made the decision that guards in this position typically made. The wrong one, watched the one that professional training and personal investment in not being arrested combined to produce in people who had committed to a side and couldn't unbind from it at 40 meters in a dark corridor with 2 seconds to reconsider. The first weapon discharge. The energy bolt hit his chest plate, same location as the cursed earth hit, the left thoracic section already showing 12% integrity reduction. His systems logged the additional degradation, 23% cumulative, and flagged it as significant without flagging it as critical, because his threshold for critical was considerably higher than 23%, and OCP had been thorough about that if nothing else. He covered the 40 meters in a time that the guard's threat response systems were not equipped to process as a continuous event rather than a series of instantaneous transitions from one distance to another, and the engagement at the door was brief and one-sided, and conducted with the precise application of non-lethal force to specific anatomical targets that his medical database had long since memorized. Both guards were on the floor before they had fully registered that the distance between themselves and the threat had ceased to be a relevant variable. Dredd was at the door, the room beyond open with the compressed energy of a threshold, crossed by someone who had decided the crossing was complete before the door had finished moving, and Dredd entered the Council of Five's meeting with the implacable certainty of a law that had located the exact room in which it needed to be applied. RoboCop followed. 5 faces turned toward them. 5 expressions transitioning through the rapid sequential states of surprise, assessment, and the specific recalibration that people undertook when they understood that what had just entered the room was not a problem that could be managed. Carla Dressler sat at the head of the table. She was, in person, somewhat smaller than her operational significance had suggested she would be. A compact woman with the precise, controlled features of someone who had spent decades ensuring that her face reflected exactly what she chose for it to reflect, and nothing that she didn't. She looked at Dredd. She looked at RoboCop. She looked at the 2 guards on the floor outside the door. She did not reach for a communication device. She did not reach for a weapon. She did not speak immediately. What she did, and RoboCop's systems logged this as an observation of genuine professional interest, was take a slow breath and arrange her expression into something that was not quite composed, but was performing composure with sufficient skill that a less thorough observer might not have distinguished between the two. "Judge Dredd," she said. Her voice was steady. "I was wondering when you'd find your way here." "Carla Dressler," Dredd said, "you are under arrest for conspiracy to corrupt a Justice Department officer, theft of Justice Department property, illegal arms manufacture and distribution, or in operating a criminal enterprise within Mega City 1's jurisdiction." He moved to the table. "The sentence will be determined by the Chief Judge's office. The evidence is complete. There is no mechanism by which this conversation ends differently than it's going to end." She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at RoboCop again. A longer look, the specific attention of a strategist cataloging something that fell outside her prepared frameworks and trying to determine how it had arrived at the head of the thread that had unraveled her operation. "You're the thing from the Angeltown Rift," she said. "The machine badge." A pause. "My source told me you'd arrived. She didn't know what you were." "No," RoboCop said, "she didn't. I should have moved faster." "Yes," RoboCop said. "Ishan, you should have." Dressler looked at the table's surface for a moment, at the documents spread across it, the Council of Five's meeting materials, the administrative cover of legitimate governance draped over operational criminality with the practiced ease of someone who had been arranging that particular disguise for a very long time. Then she put her hands on the table, palms down, and looked at Dredd with the expression of a woman who had run out of moves and understood it completely. "How long?" she said. "From the cursed Earth array to this room?" Dredd looked at her without expression. 4 days. Something moved across her face, too quickly and too controlled to be named precisely, but carrying the specific quality of a professional's involuntary acknowledgement of work that had been done at a standard she recognized. She said nothing else. The Council of Five were processed with the thorough efficiency of a system that had been built for exactly this function. Park and Vance arrived from the lower floors at Dredd's signal, the patrol secured without incident, the building cleared in 22 minutes with the methodical completeness of judges who understood that a clean scene was a complete scene, and a complete scene was the difference between a conviction and a proceeding. RoboCop stood at the sixth-floor window while the processing completed, looking at Mega City 1's nightscape. The mega block towers against the smog line, the city's perpetual electrical glow, the H-wagons tracing their patrol lines across the dark above it all. 800 million people, sleeping, waking, committing crimes, preventing them, living the compressed, a pressurized existence of a civilization that had survived its own near destruction and had rebuilt itself with the materials available, which were the same materials that had nearly destroyed it in the first place. He had been in this city for less than a week. Detroit felt further away than the dimensional rift's distance could fully account for. Behind him, Dredd was completing the arrest documentation with the patient. Systematic thoroughness that RoboCop had come to understand was not bureaucracy for its own sake, but was the law's insistence on its own legibility. The requirement that what had been done could be read, verified, and held against the standard that justified doing it. The record, clean, complete, every step documented. He turned from the window. "Quinlan," he said. "Being processed now," Dredd said, without looking up from the documentation. Sector 22 team moved on her quarters at 0230. She didn't resist. A pause. "She knew." "Yeah," RoboCop said. "She knew." The city hummed below them, indifferent and enormous, and somewhere in its lower depths, in the ISO cube processing infrastructure that ran 24 hours because crime ran 24 hours, 2 new cases were being opened with the impersonal efficiency of a system that had done this 10,000 times and would do it 10,000 more. 12 years of careful architecture dismantled in 4 days. RoboCop filed this under the category that his processing architecture had developed across years of Detroit service for outcomes that the law had required and the law had produced, and that carried, alongside the operational satisfaction, were the specific weight of what they had cost to arrive at. The weight was familiar. He had learned long ago that it never got lighter. He had learned somewhat more recently that the not getting lighter was not a failure of the law. It was the law being honest about what it asked. Chaos Day came every year, whether Mega City 1 was ready for it or not. The anniversary fell on the 14th of September, marking the date, now 23 years past, when Judge Death and the Dark Judges had descended on the city with the particular theological conviction of beings who had concluded that life itself was the ultimate crime, and that justice therefore demanded its elimination. 360 million dead in a single incursion. A number so large that the human mind's capacity for grief had simply declined to process it at the scale it deserved, and had instead retreated to the smaller, manageable geometries of personal loss. A name, a face, a specific absence in a specific apartment in a specific megablock that was now occupied by someone who had never known who lived there before, and had been given no particular reason to ask. The city commemorated it annually with the specific ambivalence of a population that had survived something unsurvivable and had not entirely forgiven itself for surviving. Some sectors held vigils. Some held riots. Some held both simultaneously in adjacent blocks. The vigil candles and the burning barricades sharing the same night sky with the resigned coexistence of a city that had long since stopped expecting its grief and its rage to occupy separate spaces. In the days leading up to the anniversary, Mega City One's crime statistics climbed with the mathematical predictability of a phenomenon that had been documented for 23 consecutive years, and that the Justice Department had learned to prepare for the way meteorologists prepared for seasonal weather, not with surprise, but with the particular weariness of people who understood that preparation reduced casualties without eliminating the event that made preparation necessary. RoboCop had been in Mega City 1 for 19 days. In those 19 days, he had been assessed, deployed, and assessed again. The Chief Judge's Office had issued a provisional operational status determination that classified him as a non-judicial law enforcement entity operating under temporary collaborative mandate. Language that Dredd had read aloud to him from the official document with the flatness of someone delivering a diagnosis, and that RoboCop had received with the equanimity of someone who had spent most of his operational existence being classified in ways that prioritized institutional comfort over accuracy. The determination authorized him to operate in the field under Dredd's direct supervision, to carry and discharge his weapon in defense of life and in support of judicial operations, and to exercise advisory law enforcement functions. A category whose operational content was sufficiently undefined that it had in practice certain meant whatever the specific situation required. He had used this flexibility with the careful precision of someone who understood that provisional status was a structure with load-bearing walls, and that the walls would hold only as long as the structure was not asked to support more weight than its builders had designed for. The Dressler case had been processed. The Council of Five had been formally dissolved by the Chief Judge's Office, which had issued a statement acknowledging the Council's existence for the first time in its 40-year operational history, a bureaucratic candor that the city's media had received with the enthusiasm of an institution that had been handed material it hadn't needed to dig for. One Dressler's ISO cube sentence had been set at 30 years, reduced from the maximum by factors that the Chief Judge's Office had not made public, and that Dredd had received with the tightened jaw of a man who had decided, after reflection, that 30 years was the law's determination, and the law's determination was what he served. Quinlan's sentence had not been reduced. 40 years handed down by a tribunal convened specifically because the case involved a serving judge. The proceedings conducted with the scrupulous formality of an institution examining its own failure, with the knowledge that the examination's integrity was the only instrument available for preventing the failure from defining the institution rather than the other way around. RoboCop had submitted his evidence documentation to the tribunal with the complete chain intact. Every step, every decision, every moment where the investigation had required judgment rather than procedure, fully disclosed and fully justified. The tribunal had reviewed his documentation for 6 hours. It had found the evidence chain clean. It had found his methods, the 41-hour controlled intelligence operation, the secondary channel monitoring, the deliberate management of Quinlan's operational environment, to be within acceptable judicial parameters under the specific circumstances, a determination that had required 3 separate votes and that the presiding judge had noted in her written conclusion represented an expansion of established precedent rather than a violation of it. Dredd had read this conclusion without visible reaction. Afterward, he had said, "Next time, we tell the Chief Judge's Office about the 41-hour window before we run it, not after." "Agreed," RoboCop had said. "That's the only adjustment." "Agreed," RoboCop had said again. It was, he had reflected, the closest thing to professional validation he had received since arriving in this universe. He filed it accordingly. Now it was the 13th of September, the day before Chaos Day's anniversary, and Mega City 1 was vibrating with the particular frequency of a city that was simultaneously grieving and preparing to defend itself against the grief's expression. The sector house had been on elevated alert since 0600. H-wagon patrol density above sectors 9, 10, and 12 had tripled. The judges on street level moved in pairs rather than solo. their posture carrying the specific quality of people who were not tense, tension was a liability, but were fully, continuously ready in the way that a coiled spring was ready. Not with effort, but with position. Dredd had been on shift for 16 hours. RoboCop knew this because he had been on the same shift, and because Dredd's shift lengths were a phenomenon he had noted with the professional interest of someone who understood stamina as an operational variable and was encountering a version of it that exceeded his reference parameters. They were in the sector house at 1847 hours when the call came in. Block War, Enright Megablock versus Zondergaard Megablock, Sector 11. Anniversary triggered. It had started, as block wars often did, with an insult. Or escalated with the specific velocity of a grievance that had been building pressure for 23 years and had found the anniversary's emotional temperature sufficient to breach its containment. By the time the first judge response unit arrived, the connecting walkways between the two blocks had been barricaded with improvised material, and the barricades were burning, and residents from both blocks were attempting to advance through the fire with the committed enthusiasm of people who had temporarily subordinated their survival instinct to something that felt, in the moment, more important. Standard response: 3 units, H-wagon support, crowd suppression ordnance, 8 escalating judicial authority up to and including lethal force as a last resort defined by a specific procedural threshold that the Academy of Law had spent considerable institutional effort calibrating and that the street spent considerable effort testing the edges of. Non-standard variable, embedded within the Enright megablock on the 43rd floor, in an apartment that had been occupied for 11 months by a resident whose legal registration indicated a retired municipal worker named Gregor Vass, was a cell of 4 individuals connected to Dressler's dismantled organization, specifically the portion of the organization that had been responsible for the directed energy weapons manufacture. Dressler's arrest had severed their command structure, but not their operational capability. And the Chaos Day chaos was not accidental from their perspective. The block war had been seeded with 3 carefully placed provocateurs whose job had been to ensure that the anniversary's emotional pressure found its release point in Sector 11 rather than elsewhere, generating the specific crowd density and Justice Department resource commitment that would allow the cell to move a consignment of the unclassified hardware out of the megablock under cover of the response operation. RoboCop had identified this from a surveillance pattern anomaly. 3 residents of different floors whose movement data over the preceding 72 hours showed a correlation that was individually unremarkable and collectively significant, and a pattern that his systems had flagged at 12:03 hours, and that he had spent 6 hours verifying before bringing it to Dredd at 18:31 hours with the evidence architecture complete rather than preliminary. Dredd had looked at it for 4 minutes. "The block war is the distraction," he said. "Yes. The consignment moves during the response operation. The cell has a route planned through the block's service infrastructure, maintenance corridors, waste processing access, the same design philosophy as the slab." RoboCop looked at the surveillance data. The hardware is the problem. If the directed energy platforms reach the open market, they become a Chaos Day resource. Dredd said it with the flatness of someone for whom the implication was complete, rather than requiring development. Every anniversary brings them out. Chi groups that want to make a statement. The hardware amplifies the statement into a massacre. He stood. "How long before the cell moves?" The block war response units arrived at 1839. "The cell will wait for maximum resource commitment. My projection puts their movement window at 1920 to 1940. It was 1849. 31 minutes. They took a H-wagon, Dredd at the controls with the practiced authority of a man for whom the machine was an extension of his operational will rather than a vehicle he was piloting, and RoboCop occupying the co-pilot position with the slight geometric awkwardness of a chassis not originally designed for H-wagon seating, but that had adapted with the pragmatic flexibility of something built to function in environments it hadn't been designed for, which described most of RoboCop's operational history. Below them, Sector 11 was lit with the specific light of a situation that had exceeded the boundaries of what light was supposed to illuminate. The connecting walkways between Enright and Sundergaard burned with the orange-white of improvised barricade fires, the crowd movement on both sides showing the fluid, chaotic pattern of a confrontation that had not yet resolved into the specific choreography of sustained violence, but was approaching it with the committed momentum of a situation that had found its release point and was not interested in being redirected. 3 judge response units were on the walkways. RoboCop tracked them in his targeting display, managing the crowd with the combination of judicial authority and crowd suppression equipment that the procedure specified, buying time, preventing the confrontation from crossing the threshold into the category of response that neither side actually wanted, but that the anniversary's emotional pressure was building toward. The crowd, RoboCop said. What about it? The 3 provocateurs who seeded the block war. If we can identify and extract them from the crowd before the cell moves, the confrontation loses its escalation engine. The block war de-escalates on its own timeline. The response units can manage it without additional commitment. Dredd looked at him. You can identify them in that crowd? RoboCop's targeting system was already running behavioral analysis across the crowd data from the H-Wagon sensor package, mapping movement patterns, escalation behaviors, in the specific signature of individuals who were directing confrontation rather than participating in it organically. I have 2 confirmed, he said. The third is probable. I need 40 seconds at lower altitude to confirm. Dredd dropped the H-Wagon. The 40 seconds produced the confirmation. 3 individuals, distributed through the crowd with the spacing of a coordinated operation, each positioned at a specific point in the confrontation's geometry where their actions, a thrown object here, a shouted incitement there, a physical provocation at the critical moment, would produce maximum escalation effect. Can you direct the response unit judges to their positions without broadcasting on the main channel? RoboCop asked. Because the main channel, he did not need to complete the sentence. As I have a direct line to the senior unit judge, Dredd said. Personal comm bypasses sector infrastructure. The Dressler operation's legacy, RoboCop said. I established the direct line the morning after Quinlan's arrest, Dredd said. Standard procedure adjustment. A pause. Next time, we tell the chief judge's office before we run it, not after. You already have, RoboCop said, the tribunal's procedural expansion. The tribunal documented what we did. I'm establishing what we do. He opened the direct line and transmitted the 3 positions with the economy of a man who had learned to give field instructions in the minimum language required to make them unambiguous. The response unit judges moved. The 3 provocateurs were extracted from the crowd with the quiet surgical precision of people who had been told exactly where to look and what to do when they found it. The crowd's escalation pattern shifted. Not immediately, not completely, but measurably, the emotional pressure losing its directional focus without the provocateur's coordination, beginning the slow, uneven process of finding its own equilibrium. It would not be calm tonight. It would not be resolved. The anniversary would carry its weight regardless of what was done with the provocateurs, because the weight was the point. Because 360 million dead could not be managed away with a tactical extraction, and the city's insistence on feeling that weight, even when the feeling produced fire and barricades. Theater was not something that law enforcement could or should entirely suppress, but it would not be a massacre. RoboCop filed this distinction under the category that his processing architecture reserved for outcomes where the law's function was not to eliminate what was human, but to keep the human from eliminating itself. Dredd had already set the H-Wagon on a course for Enright Megablock's roof. 43rd floor, Gregor Vass's apartment. 4 individuals with directed energy hardware in a movement window that had 8 minutes left on its clock. The hardware first, RoboCop said. The cell second, in that sequence. Explain. If the cell triggers the hardware during the engagement, in a megablock with several thousand residents, in corridors designed to channel blast and energy discharge. The hardware first, Dredd said, support and adjusted the H-Wagon's descent angle. The roof landing took 12 seconds. The building's internal architecture matched the service corridor pattern that RoboCop's analysis had projected. The maintenance infrastructure of a megablock designed to house 100,000 people generated specific structural necessities, specific access patterns, specific routes that anyone who understood large-scale residential construction could map from first principles even without prior intelligence. He mapped it as they moved. 43rd floor in 4 minutes via the service stairwell, the stairwell empty at this hour because the block war's noise and the anniversary's emotional temperature had driven the building's residents either to their windows or to the communal viewing areas, not to the service infrastructure. In the apartment door was the standard Mega City 1 residential security fitting, rated, according to the manufacturer's specifications, to resist forced entry for approximately 45 seconds against standard judicial entry tools. RoboCop's entry took 6 seconds. The apartment beyond was the apartment of people who were somewhere else mentally, stripped of the personal material that made a space a home, reduced to the functional minimum of people who were using a location rather than living in it. 4 individuals in the process of moving 4 cases of hardware toward the service exit in the apartment's northwest corner. They turned. They assessed. They made the same decision that the slab guards had made, and for the same reasons and with the same result. The engagement was conducted in the 43rd floor apartment of Enright Megablock, Sector 11, Megacity 1, on the eve of the 23rd Chaos Day anniversary between 1923 and 1928 hours. It lasted 5 minutes and produced 4 arrests, the successful seizure of 11 directed energy hardware units, and a 31% cumulative integrity reduction in RoboCop's left thoracic armor section that his systems flagged as approaching the threshold where operational capacity would begin to be affected. He filed the damage assessment with the thoroughness he applied to everything and noted that the threshold had not been crossed. Dredd looked at him in the apartment's aftermath, at the damage armor section, at the precise, controlled efficiency of a figure that had absorbed significant punishment and was still standing with the same quality of presence it had arrived with. "You need repairs," Dredd said. "Yes. The sector house has a tech division workshop. It's not OCP's facility," RoboCop said. "I know. I'll manage." He looked at the seized hardware, at 11 directed energy weapons that would not be in the street tomorrow, on the anniversary, in the hands of people whose grief had found an escalation engine. "It's manageable." Dredd looked at him for a moment with the evaluative regard that had become, over 19 days, something that RoboCop's systems no longer categorized as assessment, but had developed a different classification for, one that his processing architecture had not yet assigned a precise label to, because the label would have required acknowledging that the relationship between 2 law enforcement officers who had entered a Mega City 1 apartment on the eve of Chaos Day and done what needed doing had crossed a threshold that the provisional operational status determination had not accounted for. 19 days, Dredd said. "Yes. You've been here 19 days. "I'm aware." Dredd looked at the apartment, at the city visible through the window, the block war's fires still burning in the connecting walkways, smaller now. The crowd's energy finding its level without the provocateur's directional force, the anniversary carrying its weight across Mega City 1's dark in the way it always did, in the way it would for as many years as the city endured. "Tomorrow," Dredd said. "Tomorrow is Chaos Day." "Yes. It will be a difficult shift." "Yes," RoboCop said. "It will." Dredd looked at the window for a moment longer. "I'll want you on it," he said. It was not a question. It was not an order. It occupied a category between the two that RoboCop's processing architecture had not previously needed a label for, and that it now assigned one to, quietly without announcement, in the way that systems updated their classification frameworks when the available categories proved insufficient for what the operational reality had produced. "I'll be there," RoboCop said. Below them, Mega City 1 burned and grieved and endured, as it always had, as it always would, enormous and indifferent and full of 800 million reasons to show up anyway. Chaos Day arrived like a verdict. Not with drama. Mega City 1 had learned that the most dangerous things rarely announce themselves dramatically, that the events which defined the city's history had a habit of beginning in the mundane register of ordinary shifts, ordinary calls, ordinary moments that became extraordinary through the specific alchemy of cascading consequence. The morning of the 14th came in gray and chemical smoggy, The sky above the mega blocks carrying its usual institutional yellow-gray, the city's ambient noise at its usual frequency, the H-wagon patrols at their elevated density, moving through their routes with the practiced regularity of a system that had been told to expect the worst and had organized itself accordingly. By 800, the first incident reports were filing. By 900, the incident reports had become a pattern. By 1000, when the pattern had a shape that RoboCop's analytical systems identified with the cold precision of a recognition that his human residue found genuinely alarming. Not because the shape was unexpected, but because it was coordinated in a way that the Justice Department's Chaos Day preparedness frameworks had not fully accounted for, a coordination that bore the operational fingerprint of something that had been planned with the specific knowledge of how the Justice Department deployed on this date at these hours across these sectors. The Dressler network was not as dismantled as the arrests had suggested. He was in Dredd's sector house office at 10:12 hours, mapping the incident pattern across a tactical display that Tech Division had configured for his use 3 days after his arrival, and that he had been quietly improving ever since with modifications that Tech Division's senior judge had reviewed and approved with the specific expression of a professional encountering work better than what they would have produced themselves, in deciding that the appropriate response was appreciation rather than defensiveness. 12 simultaneous disturbances across 6 sectors, block confrontations, infrastructure sabotage, a chemical threat at a water reclamation facility in Sector 19, and, most significantly, 3 coordinated attacks on Justice Department communication relay stations in Sectors 8, 11, and 14, each time to degrade the sector-to-sector coordination that the Chaos Day response framework depended on. The relay attacks were precise, too precise for opportunistic Chaos Day violence. They had been planned with knowledge of the relay station's locations, their structural vulnerabilities, and the specific communication architecture they supported. Information that was not publicly available and that the Justice Department's own operational security protocols were designed to protect. The Dressler network, Dredd said. He was at the window. He had been at the window for 40 seconds, which in Dredd's operational language was a period of sustained reflection rather than observation. A dormant component, RoboCop said. Something compartmentalized from the Council of Five's operational structure. A cell or cells that Dressler maintained separately, with sufficient isolation that the arrest didn't reach them, and sufficient activation protocol that they could be triggered remotely. He paused. She activated them before her arrest. The 41-hour window. We controlled what she knew we knew. We didn't control what she'd already set in motion before we identified her. Dredd turned from the window. She anticipated the possibility of arrest. She anticipated everything. She'd been running this for 20 years. RoboCop looked at the tactical display, at the 12 incident points in the 3 degraded relay stations and the shape they made together. The shape of a city being systematically destabilized at its communication and response infrastructure on the 1 day per year when its emotional temperature made destabilization most effective. The relay attacks are the primary threat. If the sector communication architecture degrades further, the Justice Department's coordinated response capacity drops below the threshold required to manage simultaneous multi-sector incidents at this intensity. How far below threshold? At current incident rate and relay degradation, within 90 minutes, the response framework begins fragmenting into sector-level operations without cross-sector coordination. Individual sectors can manage their own situations. They cannot support each other. And the incidents are calibrated to that fragmentation point, each one below the threshold that would require cross-sector support under normal communication conditions, but collectively exceeding the capacity of isolated sector response once coordination fails. Dredd absorbed this with the stillness of a man building a tactical picture from pieces he found professionally offensive. They've wargamed the Justice Department's response framework, he said. For at least a year, RoboCop said. Possibly longer. This is Dressler's real investment. Not the H-wagons, not the directed energy hardware. Those were operational tools. This, he indicated the display, this is the strategic objective. A chaos day in which the Justice Department cannot coordinate its response. In which the city's grief and rage and anniversary pressure finds a law enforcement vacuum instead of a containing force. And in that vacuum, criminal interests move freely, territory is consolidated, competing organizations are eliminated under cover of Chaos Day violence, while the Justice Department is managing 12 simultaneous incidents with degraded communication and no cross-sector support. He paused. Dressler's organization was the most sophisticated criminal logistics operation in the city. She didn't build it to run contraband hardware. She built it to inherit the city. The contraband hardware was the transition mechanism, armed contractors positioned to take advantage of the vacuum she was creating. Dredd was very still. She planned this from inside an isocube, he said. She planned this before she was arrested. The activation protocol was already running. Arrest was a contingency she'd prepared for. RoboCop looked at him steadily. We took her off the board. We didn't take the board. The tactical display showed a new incident report filing. Sector 8, the first relay station's backup system coming under attack 30 minutes after the primary. Whoever was running the dormant cells operation had anticipated the backup timeline. Dredd moved to the comm. I need a direct line to the chief judge's office. Now. The relay degradation, RoboCop said. Your direct line runs through the Sector 9 communication infrastructure. If Sector 9's relay is targeted, Sector 9's relay is not yet targeted. No, it's the last one, which means it's next. He looked at the display. They're working inward from the perimeter. Sector 8, 11, and 14 first. The next logical target is the Central Sector Communication Hub. Sector 9. Dredd stopped with the comm in his hand. The implication settled into the room with the weight of a tactical reality that had just shifted the nature of every decision available. They're coming here, RoboCop said. The Sector 9 relay is the central hub. If it goes down, the remaining sector communications lose their coordination backbone. The entire response framework fails. He paused. This sector house is the target. Dredd set the comm down. He looked at the tactical display. At the 12 incident points in the 3 degraded relays and the inward working pattern of a strategic operation that had just been fully mapped. How long? He said. RoboCop ran the projection with a thoroughness that the situation's urgency made necessary and that his system's speed made possible. 40 minutes, he said, based on the interval between the previous relay attacks and the operational logistics of moving an attack unit to this location from the most probable staging area my analysis can identify. He paused. Minimum, it could be less. How many? The previous relay attacks used units of between 6 and 8 individuals with directed energy hardware. The Sector 9 relay is the critical target. They'll weight it accordingly. He ran the calculation. My projection is 12 to 15, possibly more. And we have 14 judges currently in the sector house, 6 on street patrol. The street patrol cannot be recalled without broadcasting on the sector communication infrastructure. He looked at Dredd, which they're monitoring. Dredd stood very still for 4 seconds. Then he made 4 decisions in the space that 4 seconds contained when occupied by a man who had spent 31 years making decisions under the specific pressure of a city that did not provide the luxury of time. He opened his personal direct line, the one established after Quinlan's arrest, bypassing sector infrastructure, and reached the chief judge's office in 30 seconds and communicated the tactical picture in 90, with the precision and economy of someone who understood that the person receiving the information needed facts sequenced by operational priority rather than by narrative logic. When he dispatched 2 of the sector house's off-duty judges to reinforce the relay room with instructions delivered in person, without electronic communication, because in-person instruction left no signal for the dormant cell's monitoring to detect. He reviewed the sector house's defensive architecture with the systematic attention of a man converting a building he had worked in for 11 years from a familiar environment into a tactical position, identifying fields of fire, choke points, structural reinforcements, and the specific vulnerabilities that a directed energy weapon attack would exploit that a conventional projectile weapon attack would not. And he looked at RoboCop. Your armor integrity, he said, 31% cumulative degradation in the left thoracic section, operational capacity unaffected at present. Add an additional 20% degradation to that section, my systems project. Can you fight? The question was direct in the way that Dredd's questions were always direct, stripped of the diplomatic softening that might have made it easier to receive, but that would have made it less useful to answer. Yes, RoboCop said, I can fight. The relay room is the critical point. If they breach the sector house and reach the relay room, the communication backbone fails regardless of what happens to the attack unit afterward. Dredd looked at him. I need someone on the relay room who cannot be moved. RoboCop understood the assignment. He understood it with the complete, unambiguous clarity of someone receiving a tactical role that had been defined by a specific combination of capability and damage tolerance. The kind of role that was assigned to the thing that could absorb what others couldn't and keep functioning where others wouldn't. He had been assigned this role before, in Detroit, in circumstances that his memory preserved with the specific sharpness of experiences that had shaped what came after them in ways that were not recoverable. He had held that position then. I'll hold the relay room, he said. The 40 minutes became 38. The attack came at 11:56 hours, from 3 directions simultaneously. The sector house's northeast vehicle entrance, the western service corridor, and the roof. The aerial approach executed by 2 individuals in stolen H-wagon maintenance harnesses, who had apparently been positioned above Sector 9 in a maintenance drone staging area for the last 6 hours, waiting. The coordination was professional. The execution was professional. The directed energy hardware was, as RoboCop's targeting systems confirmed in the first exchange of fire, the full specification, the H-wagon power cell weapons that had been in development since before Dressler's arrest, the unclassified hardware that Tech Division had never fully cataloged because the examples seized in the Cursed Earth and Enright megablock operations had been the prototypes rather than the production units. The sector house's 14 judges responded with the organized efficiency of people who had been told what was coming, why it was coming, and what the defensive priorities were, which was significantly more than the attack's planners had accounted for. The advantage of surprise was not entirely eliminated. 3 judges were down in the first 90 seconds, alive but out of the engagement, the directed energy hits producing the combined heat and force trauma that the hardware was designed to produce. But it was substantially reduced. RoboCop was in the relay room. The relay room was in the sector house's interior core, a deliberately protected location, no exterior wall exposure, accessible through a single reinforced corridor that ran 22 meters from the sector house's central junction to the relay room's security door. 22 meters of corridor with a single entry point and a single exit point, and RoboCop standing at the junction end of it with the Auto 9 in his hand and the full weight of his operational existence brought to bear on the specific tactical problem of ensuring that nothing passed him. They sent 4 at the corridor. The first 2 went down at 18 meters, the second 2 at 11. Non-lethal, his targeting system had been calibrated since his first day in Mega City 1 for the specific force parameters that Mega City 1 law regarded as proportional, a calibration that required more precision than Detroit's parameters had because Mega City 1's standards were different in ways he had found professionally interesting rather than operationally restrictive. The calibration held under fire with the reliability of systems built to hold under fire. The corridor held. They sent 3 more at 11 minutes. He held the corridor. They sent 2 more at 19 minutes with the directed energy hardware. The first shot hit his left thoracic section, cumulative integrity now at 61%, systems flagging operational capacity beginning to be affected, targeting precision degrading by a measurable percentage that his processors translated into the specific tactical adjustments required to compensate for degraded precision with the same outcome. He held the corridor. At 23 minutes, the attack unit's coordination began to fragment. Dredd had worked through the sector house with the systematic efficiency of a man for whom the building was both an environment and an argument. Mas, in the argument he was making, moved through the northeast entrance, the western service corridor, and the roof access point with the implacable patience of law enforcement that had decided the outcome and was implementing it rather than determining it. At 31 minutes, the last member of the attack unit still capable of independent action was processed in the sector house's eastern stairwell by Judge Park, who had come from Sector 22 for the Dressler operation and had remained in Sector 9 afterward on a temporary attachment that had been administratively extended twice without anyone formally examining why. Silence. The sector house's communication infrastructure, the relay room, the backbone, the coordination architecture that Dressler's dormant cell had expended its entire operational capacity attempting to destroy, was intact. Functioning broadcasting. Across the city, the 12 simultaneous incidents were receiving coordinated response. The fragmentation point had not been reached. The vacuum had not been created. RoboCop stood in the relay room corridor for a moment after the last transmission confirmed the all clear. His systems were running damage assessment with the thoroughness of an inventory that had more to list than it preferred. Left thoracic armor integrity at 61% cumulative degradation. Targeting precision at 94% of baseline. Right forearm actuator showing stress indicators consistent with sustained engagement load. 3 separate impact points on his chassis that his structural integrity monitoring flagged for priority assessment. Functional, reduced, but functional. He walked out of the corridor into the sector house's central junction, and the junction was full of the specific organized chaos of an aftermath. Judges processing the attack unit's members, tech division personnel already moving toward the relay room with diagnostic equipment, a medical team working on the 3 judges who had gone down in the first 90 seconds. Dredd was in the junction. He was standing in the way that he stood after engagements, entirely still, the stillness of a man who had expended considerable force and had reabsorbed it, returning to his default state of contained readiness. His uniform carried the evidence of what the last 31 minutes had contained. His jaw was set. His breathing beneath the visor was measured. He looked at RoboCop, at the damage, at the 61% integrity reading that his own scanning equipment presumably registered. The relay room, Dredd said. Intact, RoboCop said. Fully functional, Dredd nodded. A single small movement that in a man with a more expressive face would have been a longer and more elaborate acknowledgement, but that in Dredd's operational language carried the full weight of what a longer acknowledgement would have contained. The city, RoboCop said, coordinated response holding across all 12 sectors. The incident pattern is de-escalating. Dredd paused. The vacuum didn't form. No, RoboCop said. It didn't. Outside, Megacity 1 was still burning in the specific anniversary-shaped way that it burned on this date every year, with grief and rage and the specific human insistence on feeling things too large to feel, and on marking the weight of 360 million absences with fire and noise because silence was insufficient and nothing was sufficient. And the city had learned, across 23 years of trying, that the attempt was the point regardless. But the coordination held. The response framework held. The backbone transmitted. The sectors talked to each other across the city's dark and enormous geography. And the law moved through what Dressler's dormant architecture had attempted to make into a vacuum, and found that the vacuum had not formed. RoboCop stood in the junction of Sector House 9 with 61% cumulative armor degradation and 94% targeting precision, and a right forearm actuator showing stress indicators. Wyman, the damage assessment ran its inventory with the patient thoroughness of systems built to tell you exactly where you stood. He stood in Mega City 1. He had held the corridor. It was, he reflected, what he had been built to do. Whether the building was in Detroit or in a city that hadn't existed when Detroit was a functioning municipality was, operationally speaking, beside the point. The city needed the corridor held. He had held it. The Grand Hall of Justice did not impress through beauty. It impressed through mass, through the specific architectural philosophy of a civilization that had decided at some point in its institutional development that the most honest thing a building devoted to law could communicate was the weight of what law required, not the elegance of its principles or the aspiration of its ideals, but the sheer, load-bearing, immovable substance of an institution that had decided it would endure regardless of what the city threw at it, and had built accordingly. The hall rose above Megacity 1's central sector with the unadorned permanence of something that had stopped needing to justify its existence and had proceeded directly to embodying it, its facades carrying the accumulated weathering of decades of acid smog and anniversary fires, and the city's perpetual atmospheric punishment with the indifference of material that had been selected specifically for its capacity to absorb punishment without recording it. RoboCop had been summoned here 11 days after Chaos Day. The summons had come through official channels, a formal communication from the Chief Judge's office, delivered to Dredd's sector house on a data slate with the Justice Department's seal and the specific language of an institution that communicated in the Register of Finality. Not an invitation, not a request, a summons, which in Mega City One's legal vocabulary carried the weight of a determination already made and a proceeding convened to formalize it. He had read it twice. His systems had processed the language with a thoroughness he applied to documents whose implications extended beyond their literal content. Then he had set the data slate on Dredd's desk and looked at Dredd with the particular quality of attention of someone who had been in enough institutional proceedings to understand that the framing of a summons told you more about the outcome than the summons' stated subject did. The Chief Judge will determine your permanent operational status, Dredd had said. Yes, it's not a trial. It has the structure of one. Dredd had looked at him for a moment. I'll be there. You're not required to. I'll be there, Dredd said, with the finality of a sentence that had completed itself. Now RoboCop stood in the Grand Hall's primary chamber, and the chamber was everything its exterior had promised. Vast, functional, the acoustics of a space designed so that words spoken at its center reached every wall with equal clarity, ensuring that what was said in this room could not be claimed to have been misheard. The gallery above held 30 judges in full uniform, their presence the institutional weight of an audience that was simultaneously witness and record. On the Chief Judge's bench occupied the chamber's far end, a raised platform of the same unadorned ferrocrete as everything else, the Chief Judge's chair behind it carrying the specific visual authority of something that derived its significance entirely from what sat in it rather than from any decorative intention. Chief Judge Hershey sat in it. Barbara Hershey, 22 years as Chief Judge, a service record that the Justice Department's institutional memory preserved as the closest the office had come in its history to the combination of absolute judicial authority and genuine strategic intelligence that the role theoretically required and practically rarely found. Because she was 64 years old and looked like someone who had been 64 years old for approximately 30 years. Not aged so much as permanently arrived at the point of maximum institutional authority, which had a specific physical quality that RoboCop systems categorized as the somatic expression of long-term consequence bearing. Dredd stood to his left, not in the gallery, on the chamber floor. He had positioned himself there when they arrived and had not been asked to move, which told RoboCop something about Dredd's relationship with this room and with the woman behind the bench. To RoboCop's right, at a respectful distance that nonetheless communicated professional interest, stood Judge Tudor Guthrie, the administrative problem identifier from his first week, whose fascination with his case had apparently matured into something that required chamber floor proximity to a formal proceeding. RoboCop had noted his presence without remarking on it. Guthrie had responded to this acknowledgement with a slight forward lean of a man who was extremely interested in what was about to happen and was making no particular effort to disguise the fact. Chief Judge Hershey looked at RoboCop for a long moment before she spoke. Not with assessment. The assessment had been completed, RoboCop understood, long before this summons was issued, through the documentation of his 19 days of provisional operation, the tribunal's findings, the Chaos Day engagement reports, the relay room defense, and whatever Dredd's direct communications to the Chief Judge's office had contained, to which Dredd had not shared with him and which he had not asked about because he understood that there were things between Dredd and this office that preceded his arrival and that were not his to know. She looked at him the way a person looked at a question they had spent considerable time answering and were now prepared to deliver the answer to. Officer Murphy, she said, her voice in this chamber carried with the acoustic precision the architecture intended. Chief Judge Hershey, he said, you've been in Mega City 1 for 30 days. She looked at the document on the bench before her. A single data slate, the determination prepared and awaiting formal delivery. In those 30 days, you have operated under provisional mandate. Whilst you have participated in the identification and arrest of a criminal enterprise that had embedded an operative inside Justice Department infrastructure for 12 years. You have contributed to the prevention of a coordinated Chaos Day attack that, by the tactical assessment of my strategic division, would have fragmented the Justice Department's response framework across 6 sectors and created a power vacuum exploited to catastrophic effect. She paused. You have also operated outside standard judicial procedure on at least 2 documented occasions, in ways that required retrospective authorization and produced procedural precedents that this office is still developing frameworks to accommodate. Yes, RoboCop said. And I have. Hershey looked at him with the expression of someone who had just received an answer that was either refreshing in its directness or inconvenient in its completeness, and had not yet fully determined which. The question before this office, she said, is what you are in Mega City 1. Legally, operationally, institutionally. She set the data slate down. You are not a judge. You were not trained at the Academy of Law. You do not carry judicial authority as the city defines it. You are not a citizen. You have no legal standing as a resident, as a visitor, or as any category that Mega City 1's legal framework has previously been required to define. She paused. You are, in the most precise legal sense available to this office, an unprecedented condition. I'm aware, RoboCop said. What you are operationally, she is rather clearer. She looked at the document. In 30 days of provisional operation, your case clearance contribution has exceeded the 30-day average of a senior judge with 5 years of street experience. Your tactical analysis capability has demonstrated a range and precision that Tech Division's formal assessment has classified as, and I quote, without current parallel in Justice Department operational resources. Your conduct has been, with the noted procedural exceptions, consistent with judicial standards of force application, evidence handling, and operational ethics. She lifted the data slate. This office has determined that Mega City 1 requires a legal category that does not currently exist. A pause. We are creating one. The chamber was very quiet. The gallery above held its 30 judges in the specific stillness of professionals witnessing something institutional that they understood was not routine. Officer Alex Murphy, Hershey said, formerly of Detroit Metro Police, currently of no recognized jurisdiction, this office is designating you as an auxiliary law officer of Mega City 1. The designation carries operational authority equivalent to a judge sergeant in matters of investigation, evidence gathering, and tactical support. It does not carry full judicial authority. You may not pass sentence, you may not exercise judicial execution, and you may not operate independently of Justice Department supervision without specific case authorization from this office. She set the data slate down again. You will be assigned to Sector 9 under the operational oversight of Judge Dredd. She looked at Dredd. Dredd looked at the middle distance with the expression of a man who had expected this outcome and had decided that his expectations' accuracy required no visible acknowledgement. The designation is permanent, Hershey said, subject to conduct review, subject to the procedural frameworks this office will continue to develop around your operational methods. A pause. Do you understand and accept this designation? RoboCop stood in the Grand Hall of Justice, in a city he had arrived in through a dimensional rift above an interchange in the early hours of a Mega City 1 morning. In a universe that had not existed in any framework he had been built to navigate, and he ran the calculation that his systems had been running in various forms for 30 days. Detroit was gone. The door was closed. The city that had made him, that had broken him and rebuilt him and used him, and that he had served anyway, through everything, because the serving was what remained when everything else had been stripped away, was on the other side of a rift that no longer existed. But there was a city in front of him. There had always been a city in front of him. I understand, he said, and I accept. Hershey gave a single nod, the economical acknowledgement of a woman for whom ceremony was a tool rather than an end. This proceeding is concluded. The gallery above began to move, the 30 judges resuming the operational momentum that the proceeding had briefly suspended. Guthrie made a note on a data slate with the suppressed enthusiasm of a man who had been waiting to make this particular note for 30 days. Dredd remained where he was, And when the chamber had cleared to the point where the three of them occupied it with a specific quality of aftermath, he looked at RoboCop with the evaluative regard that had become, over 30 days, something that RoboCop's processing architecture had definitively labeled as a thing that operated between professional assessment and personal recognition, in the specific register of two people who had discovered that their fixed points were located in compatible positions. Auxiliary Law Officer, Dredd said. It's a new category, RoboCop said. Everything about you is a new category. In my experience, RoboCop said, yes, that's not always a disadvantage. Something moved in Dredd's expression, a fractional adjustment in the jaw's set, a minimal shift in the quality of his regard that in the architecture of Dredd's face represented the equivalent of a more expressive person's significant acknowledgement. They walked out of the Grand Hall together through the vast functional corridors of an institution that had been built to endure, into the city that made endurance necessary. Megacity 1 received them with its customary indifference. The perpetual noise, the mega-block towers, the H-wagons overhead, the city's 800 million lives generating their endless criminal and civil and human complexity in the compressed geography of a civilization that had survived its own near destruction and was surviving it still, daily, one shift at a time. A call came in at 13:47 hours. Sector 9. A weapons cache reported in an Umpty distribution network's secondary storage facility, potential connection to a dormant Dressler cell that Strategic Division's follow-up investigation had flagged as insufficiently mapped. Dredd took it without breaking stride. RoboCop fell into position beside him, the new designation settling into his operational framework with the specific quality of something that had found the place it belonged. Not because the place was comfortable, because Megacity 1 was not a city designed for comfort, and he had not been built for it. And the combination of those two facts had produced 30 days of the most operationally demanding and humanly significant work he had performed since the morning in Detroit, when Alex Murphy had walked into a warehouse and become something else. He had been something else ever since. Here in this city, under this designation, beside this particular immovable force of law, he was something else that the city needed. He had always known what to do with that. The lawmaster moved through Sector 9 streets with the authority of law in motion, and RoboCop moved beside it, and Megacity 1 opened ahead of them with its inexhaustible, indifferent, necessary demands, and they went to meet it. Because the city needed the corridor held. Because the city always needed the corridor held. Because that was what they were, in the end. Both of them. The law's insistence on showing up in whatever form the city required, for as long as the city endured. And Megacity 1 endured. Word count, 1,876, 30 days. 2 badges, 1 city. Alex Murphy had arrived through a rift above an interchange with no jurisdiction, no chain of command, and no city to serve. He left the Grand Hall of Justice with a designation that hadn't existed 30 days earlier. Operational authority in a megacity of 800 million, and a partner whose fixed point was close enough to his own that the distance between them had become, over 30 operational days, a working space rather than a gap. Dressler's network was not entirely dismantled. Strategic Division's follow-up investigation was mapping dormant cells with the patient thoroughness that the network's sophistication demanded. And the mapping would take months, and the months would produce their own complications, their own procedural edges, their own moments where the law and the institution pointed in different directions, and someone would need to decide which to follow. In the Grand Hall's gallery, 30 judges had witnessed the creation of a new legal category. In the Chief Judge's office, frameworks were being developed around operational methods that hadn't existed in Megacity 1's judicial vocabulary 30 days ago. In Sector 9, a call had come in. 2 law enforcement officers, one built from discipline into something indistinguishable from law itself, one built from a man into something that had found its way back to what the man had been, had gone to answer it. The city watched from its 800 million windows, and somewhere, in the Justice Department's deepest archival systems, a maester's equivalent, a senior tech judge with a scholar's habit and a chronicler's instinct, had begun a file. He had titled it,